She was 19 and cold. No address, no bed, no family left standing beside her. Just a dented blue box of wrenches and $9 she had earned changing a fan belt behind a gas station. And with that $9, she bought a rusted funicular operating station abandoned above Telluride, in San Miguel County, Colorado, after the cable spur vanished from county maps in 1987. The north wall leaned 3 inches out of square. The main winch housing had frozen solid under black grease. The county had said the building had been closed since 1983 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the main winch gearbox, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 40 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Toby Bell had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She learned early that waiting had different weights. There was the light kind, the kind children carried while standing at a kitchen window for a father's truck to turn into the drive. There was the heavier kind when snow came down and the truck did not come, and an adult voice in the next room went thin with worry. Then there was the kind that settled into a person's bones so gradually it did not feel like waiting at all. It felt like living. Toby was born in a mining town that had already spent most of its thunder before she arrived. The silver had gone quiet. The mills had gone quiet. Men still told stories about hard rock and dynamite, but they told them in diners now, with paper napkins tucked under coffee cups and their hands curled carefully around ceramic warmth. Her first memories were of metal sounds, a socket dropped in a coffee can, a chain hoist ticking under load, her father's boot pressing against the lower jaw of a vice while he tried to loosen a bolt that had not moved in 30 years. Her mother kept house in a way that was honest rather than pretty. Flour stayed in a tin marked with blue tape. Mended towels hung above the stove. The kitchen table wore pale circles from hot cups, and no one apologized for them. When Toby was 6, she would sit under that table with a stub of pencil and draw shapes she did not have names for yet. Gears, ratchets, pulleys, little wheels with teeth that could move a larger thing if only someone knew where to place them. Her father noticed before anyone else. He was not a loud man, and he was not a man who praised easily. He had a patient back and weathered hands, the sort of hands that seemed made for cold iron and rope burns. On Saturdays, when the weather held and the jobs were not too dangerous, he let Toby sit near the open door of the repair shed while he worked on pump housings, plough transmissions, mine carts, and the occasional logging winch dragged in from some slope where the road gave out. "Listen first," he would say. So she listened. She learned that a machine spoke in failures before it broke entirely. A bearing complained in a high dry whine. A belt slapped when it had lost its patience. A gear tooth with a chip in it made a rhythm that came around and around exact as a limp. Her mother did not understand the pleasure Toby found in such things, but she did not forbid it. She would stand at the shed door with her arms folded under her apron, watching her little girl sort washers by size on the floor. "She ought to be outside," her mother once said. Her father looked down at Toby, who was holding a greasy spring against the light like it was a found feather. "She is outside," he answered. "Just not in the way you mean." For a while, that was enough. But childhood has a way of ending without asking permission. Her father died first on a late October morning when the aspens had gone gold on the hills and frost silvered the truck windshield. A brake drum slipped from a lift at a repair yard outside Montrose. People said it was quick, which was one of those sentences adults offered when they had no useful tool in their hands. Toby was 11 at the funeral. She wore black shoes pinched at the toes and watched her mother hold a folded flag of tissue against her mouth. Afterward, her mother grew careful with everything. Careful with money, careful with laughter, careful with how long she looked at her daughter when Toby came home, smelling of oil and cold air. Within 2 years, she married Lawrence Bell's younger brother, Martin, because the house needed income and Toby needed a legal guardian if anything happened. That was how people said it. They said need as if it were a clean nail driven straight. Martin came into the house quietly enough. He did not shout, he did not throw furniture, he did not leave marks that neighbors could count. He simply rearranged the temperature of every room. The radio stopped playing during supper. Her father's work shirts disappeared from the hooks by the door. The coffee cans full of bolts were moved from the shed to a damp corner under a tarp, where rain found them and rust bloomed along the threads. Martin had soft hands for a man who spoke often of work. He wore good boots too clean at the welt and a silver watch he checked when anyone else was talking. He had a habit of smiling without opening his mouth, which made the smile seem less like kindness than measurement. Papers followed him everywhere. Insurance papers, probate forms, statements from banks Toby was too young to understand. He kept them in a brown leather folder with a broken strap, and whenever her mother looked at that folder, her eyes moved away from it. There had been money once, not much by the standards of wealthy people, but enough for a child whose parents had thought carefully before spending, a trust people called it. Her father had left his share of the repair business. Her mother had signed documents after he died. Later, after her mother became ill, more documents came. And Toby remembered Martin standing in the kitchen with a pen held toward her mother's hand. Her mother's hair had grown thin by then. The illness made her sleep in the afternoons, one palm open on the quilt as if she had let go of something in a dream. Toby was 15. She stood in the doorway and watched her mother sign where Martin pointed. There was no anger in the room. That was the worst of it, only the clock above the stove and the dry scratch of the pen. The last person who knew what Toby had been given was not a lawyer or a banker. It was her father's older cousin, Elias Rook. Elias lived outside Ridgeway in a cabin built against a stand of spruce with a shed behind it that smelled of gear oil, pine shavings, coal dust and wintergreen tobacco. He had repaired tramway engines, ore bucket drives, mill hoists, farm winches, and any gearbox heavy enough that 3 men had to curse before it could be moved. His left eye watered in cold wind. His right hand was missing the last joint of the index finger, taken by a careless chain in 1969, and he never hid it. He said a missing part was just another measurement. Every other weekend, from the time Toby was 12 until the spring she turned 17, Elias came for her in a green Ford with a cracked bench seat. Martin did not like it, but he liked public arguments even less, and Elias was known by too many men who remembered Toby's father. So the old man would knock twice, stand with his hat in both hands, and wait while Toby came out carrying the dented blue wrench box he had given her. Those weekends were the only times she felt time move at the right speed. They began with breakfast at Elias's table, oatmeal, black coffee for him, milk for her. Then he opened the shed doors and let the morning in. He did not teach by speeches. He taught by placing a damaged part on a rag and waiting for Toby to name what was wrong with it. She learnt to clean old grease with kerosene and patience, to read stamped numbers on bearing races, to measure backlash with a dial indicator, to pack a seal without bruising the lip, to turn a shaft by hand and feel whether the trouble came from teeth, bearings, or bad alignment. On rainy Saturdays, she made her copy diagrams from old service manuals, worm gears, spur gears, reduction drives, drum brakes. She had no natural gift for drawing, but Elias did not ask for beauty. He asked for accuracy. If a line wandered, she slid the paper back without comment. If she guessed, she closed the manual. Again, he would say. By late afternoon, when the light grew blue under the spruce, he let her work on the practice gearbox mounted on the bench. It had once belonged to a mine hoist, and the cast-iron casing was cracked beyond use, but inside it held the whole small weather of mechanical truth, tooth to tooth. Oil channel to bearing, load to resistance, nothing moved without touching something else. That was Elias's gospel. He said it once when she was 14. After she had spent half an hour trying to force a cover plate into place while one hidden dowel pin sat proud by the thickness of a fingernail. Never force what asks to be understood. He said it without softness, but he said it with his hand resting on the bench beside hers, close enough that she felt the warmth of another person who did not hurry her. She carried that sentence afterward as if it were a tool wrapped in cloth. It meant that impatience was not strength. It meant that a machine, a house, a person, a life gone crooked under load might still be answered if someone became careful enough. When Elias died, he did it in the plain manner of men who have spent a life among practical things. He stacked firewood in March, came inside, sat in his chair, and did not rise again. Toby was 17, 2 months from finishing high school, and Martin drove her to the funeral because people would have noticed if he had not. The service was small. Mechanics came in clean shirts. A retired tram operator from RA stood by the grave and cried without sound. Toby stood with her hands clenched so tightly the knuckles ached. Elias had promised her the manuals, the practice gearbox, and his roll-away chest of tools. Nothing came. The cabin was sold. The shed was cleared before she could get a ride back. A neighbour told her men in a white box truck had taken the heavy tools, the hoist parts, the cabinets, even the service manuals stacked under the window. Martin said debts had to be settled. He said old iron brought less than people imagined. He said grief made young people sentimental. Only the dented blue wrench box remained because Toby had carried it home herself after the funeral. Inside were 6 combination wrenches, a stubby screwdriver, a feeler gauge with 3 blades missing, Elias's old brass oil can, and a folded scrap of paper where he had written bearing numbers in pencil. She kept it under her bed, pushed back against the wall, where even Martin's careful eyes did not often go. By then her mother had been gone almost a year. Death had taken her by inches, and Martin had become guardian in full. The house changed again after that. Curtains came down for washing and never returned. Her mother's sewing basket disappeared. The framed photograph of Toby's parents at a 4th of July picnic was moved from the mantel to a drawer. Martin rented out the shed to a man who stored snowmobile parts in it, then complained when Toby stood outside too long looking through the dirty window. The winter Toby turned 18 was long and hard. Snow sat in the gutters. The furnace clicked and laboured. Martin spent evenings at the kitchen table with the brown leather folder open before him, writing figures on yellow legal pads. Sometimes a bill collector called, and he answered in a voice so pleasant it made Toby leave the room. He had begun dressing better, not worse. A new wool coat, new gloves, a truck with heated seats. The house, meanwhile, became spare around the edges, as if it were being quietly eaten. On her birthday, Toby came home from a day's work at a tyre shop in Delta, where the owner let her sweep floors, mount tyres, and sometimes help with alignments. Her hands were raw from cold rubber and soap. She found her blue wrench box sitting on the front step, beside a paper grocery sack filled with her clothes. The porch light was on, though. It was not yet dark. Martin stood inside the storm door behind him in the dim hall. The woman he had married after her mother's death stood with one hand against the wall. She had tried now and then to be kind in the way timid people are kind when it costs nothing. She had once folded Toby's laundry. She had once put cough drops by her bed. Toby had let those small offerings stand for more than they were because she was tired. Now the woman did not speak. Martin opened the door only wide enough for his voice. "You are 18 now. The rest is yours." 8 words. They were tidy words. Exact. Legal. Words chosen before she arrived. Toby looked down at the grocery sack, at a sleeve of her mother's blue sweater caught beneath one handle, at the wrench box Elias had dented long before she owned it. There was no shouting, no scene for neighbours to remember. A truck went by on the wet road. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and stopped. She looked past Martin to the woman in the hall. The woman's mouth trembled, then closed, her eyes lowered to the floorboards. That was the betrayal Toby remembered most clearly. Not Martin's face, not the paper sack, not the cold brass knob in her hand when she reached for the door and found it pulled shut. It was the silence of the only mother-shaped person left in the house, standing warm inside while Toby stood outside with her tools. She did not pound on the door. She did not beg. She picked up the wrench box first because it mattered most, then the sack, and walked to the end of the street with snowmelt soaking the hem of her jeans. At the corner she stopped under a bare cottonwood and counted the cash in her pocket. $43.18. Her last paycheck would not come until Friday. Her phone had already been shut off. That night she slept behind the tyre shop in Delta, between a stack of worn tyres and a metal wall that ticked as the temperature fell. She used her mother's sweater for a pillow and woke before dawn with her jaw aching from cold. 6 weeks can be long enough to teach a person the map beneath the map. Toby learned which gas stations near Montrose left their restroom doors unlocked after midnight. She learned that the public library opened at 9, but the vestibule was warm by 8:10 if the custodian was kind and had not been told to move people along. She learned that the laundromat on Townsend Avenue had 2 cracked plastic chairs near the dryers where a person could sit for almost an hour if she kept her head up and her hands visible. She learned the exact weight of hunger that came after skipping supper 2 nights in a row, and the way shame could become dull if one handled it carefully enough. She moved because staying made people notice. From Delta, she rode once in the back of a produce truck to Montrose, holding the blue box between her boots. In Montrose, she worked 3 days for cash behind a garage that repaired farm equipment, cleaning sludge from a tractor transmission with a putty knife. The owner paid her less than promised, then gave her a paper cup of soup and did not meet her eyes. She took both. After Montrose came Ridgeway, reached by a ride from a woman who sold handmade soap and asked no questions after Toby answered the first 2 in one-word sentences. In Ridgeway, the spruce above town reminded her of Elias so sharply that she slept badly in a church doorway and left before sunrise. A deputy woke her once, not roughly, but with the tired politeness of a man who had done this before. "Cannot sleep here," he said. "Yes," Toby answered. He looked at the wrench box, at her red hands, at the grocery sack tied with twine. Shelter in Grand Junction. Yes. She did not go there. Grand Junction was farther from the mountains, and the farther she got, the more she felt the last pieces of herself loosen. So she kept to the roads that climbed and bent. She ate peanut butter from a jar with a plastic knife. She bought day-old rolls, instant noodles, apples bruised brown at one side. $43 became $31, then $22, then $14, and some coins. She kept $9 folded separate in the lining of the wrench box, because Elias had once said a person should always hide one last measure where panic could not spend it. The cold changed by altitude. In Delta it was damp. In Montrose it came across parking lots like a flat hand. Near Ridgeway it settled down from the peaks at sunset and entered sleeves, socks, the hollow between shoulder blades. She learned to sleep with her knees drawn up and one arm looped through the handle of the wrench box. She learned which cardboard kept its stiffness and which collapsed when frost melted into it. She learned that people were not cruel as often as she had feared, but neither were they able to save her. A waitress named Marlene gave her coffee in a paper cup behind a cafe and pretended it had been poured by mistake. A mechanic outside our Ray let her tighten lug nuts on a plough truck and paid her with 2 20s, though the work was worth less. An old man at a church rummage table gave her wool socks without calling them charity. These things kept her moving. They did not give her a home. On the 41st day, sleet fell all morning and turned the sidewalks silver. Toby had walked into the Telluride Public Library because the building was warm and because no one had yet told her to leave. Telluride in winter looked to her like a town kept under glass, bright with money in the shop windows, ski jackets passing, restaurant doors opening on smells that made her stomach tighten. Beyond all that, the mountains rose close and steep, not decorative, not gentle. They pressed in like witnesses. The library had high windows and a radiator that knocked in a patient rhythm near the periodicals. Toby sat at a table with her wrench box beneath her chair and opened an outdated newspaper because it gave her hands something to do. Her gloves had holes at the thumbs. Her right sock was wet. She had $11.62, not counting the 9 folded in the box. The classified notice was 3 inches tall. County surplus auction structure for removal or assumed viability. Former funicular operating station. UNI Incorporated slope above Telluride. Parcel excess by Old Service Road. Minimum bid $1. ASIS. NO Utilities. NO Wingate. Buyer responsible for securing site. Demolition pending spring review. Someone had circled it in pencil, then crossed out the circle. As if interest had come and gone, Toby read the notice 3 times. Then she went to the reference desk and asked the librarian where county notices were filed. Her voice came out rough from disuse. The librarian, a woman with silver hair cut straight at her chin, took her to a binder near a map cabinet. There were photographs inside a plastic sleeve. The funicular station looked less like a building than a stubborn thought nailed to the mountain. One room and a machinery bay, corrugated metal roof, board siding gone black with weather, tall timber skids under one side. Behind it, a cable tower leaned above scrub oak and snow. The note under the photograph said the station had once served a private ore incline. Then later, a maintenance tram for high structures no longer standing. Decommissioned. Abandoned. Unsafe. Unsafe was a word people used when they wanted to stop looking closely. Toby studied the machinery bay in the photograph. The door hung open enough to show the round shoulder of a drum winch and the boxy casting of a reduction gearbox. Even blurred by the copy machine and years, she recognized the shape of it. Heavy worm drive, maybe double reduction. Old but not beyond understanding, the kind of machine built by people who expected iron to outlive them. Her fingers moved once on the table, measuring without touching. A man at the next table turned a page. The radiator knocked. Outside the window, sleet changed to snow so fine it seemed suspended rather than falling. At closing time, the librarian came by and said the building would shut in 10 minutes. Toby thanked her and returned the binder exactly as she had found it. She walked into the restroom, locked herself in a stall, opened the blue wrench box, and lifted the torn felt lining with the tip of the stubby screwdriver. The $9 lay beneath it in flattened bills. 1 5, 4 1s, dry kept. She placed the bills on her knee and looked at them for a long while. $9 could buy food for 2 days if she chose carefully. It could buy bus fare part of the way to somewhere warmer. It could buy a used blanket at a thrift store or minutes on a prepaid phone. It could keep her moving just a little longer along the map beneath the map. Or it could buy a condemned machinery shed on a mountain no one wanted. She folded the bills once and put them in her coat pocket. That night she slept in a hay barn outside Norwood after walking farther than she meant to, her boots white with road salt, her hair damp at the collar. The farmer found her before sunrise. He stood in the doorway with the lantern and an expression too tired for anger. "You leaving clean?" he asked. "Yes." She swept the loose hay where she had lain, though he told her she did not need to. Before she left, she handed her a boiled egg wrapped in a napkin. She carried it in her pocket until it warmed against her palm. By noon she had made up her mind in the slow, deliberate way that had been left to her by men who fixed things instead of speaking of them too soon. She would go to the county office. She would ask about the notice. She would not explain more than necessary. If they laughed, she would stand there until they finished. If they warned her, she would listen. If the property truly cost more than the notice said, she would leave with her $9 still folded in her pocket and find another doorway before dark. But if the amount was real, if the county wanted the building gone badly enough to let it pass into the hands of a girl with cracked boots and a box of wrenches, then Toby would put her name where a name was required, not because she believed in luck, not because she thought the mountain would be kind, because a frozen gearbox was still a question. And for the first time in 6 weeks, the question had been asked in a language she understood. Late that afternoon, with snow gathering in the seams of her coat and the blue wrench box knocking against her leg, Toby Bell started down toward the county clerk's office, carrying everything she owned toward a station that had been waiting longer than she had. By first light, the road below the hay barn had turned hard and pale, and every fence wire held a narrow bead of ice. She left before the farmer returned to the doorway. There was no need to make his kindness awkward by asking for more of it. The boiled egg he had given her the morning before was gone now, eaten slowly at the edge of a culvert with the shell tucked into her pocket, because she could not bring herself to leave even that small evidence behind. Her boots had stiffened overnight. When she pressed one foot into the road shoulder, the leather bent only after a moment's argument. The nearest bus stop was nearly 4 miles away, outside a feed store where 2 black dogs slept under the loading dock and lifted their heads without barking. She stood there with the blue wrench box between her feet, watching the empty highway come silver under dawn. The posted schedule was curled under its plastic cover and faded where the sun had struck it for years. There were 3 runs that day. The first had already passed. The second was due at 10:40, if weather did not slow it. The air was 17 degrees. She did not know that number until a man in a county maintenance truck pulled in to buy coffee from the feed store and mentioned it to the cashier. Before that, she had only known the temperature by smaller facts. Her eyelashes stuck when she blinked. Her knuckles opened in thin red lines around the wrench box handle. Breath moved through the tear in her left glove and came back wet against her palm. Each time a vehicle passed, wind lifted road grit and laid it against her coat. When the bus finally came, its brakes sighed like a tired animal. The driver looked at her once, then at the wrench box, then at the grocery sack tied shut with twine. He did not ask where she had come from. He only named the fare. She counted coins into his hand with care, feeling each loss as a small dull tap inside her chest, and took a seat halfway back where the heater pushed up a thin, dusty warmth from the floor. The bus climbed and turned through country that seemed made more of stone than soil. Snow lay in the dark places beneath the scrub oak. The high ridges were clouded at their shoulders. She passed closed ranch gates, mailboxes bent by plow spray, barns with their roofs bowed under white weight. Now and then the road opened, and the San Juans appeared with that hard, severe beauty that did not invite a person closer. It only stood there, exact and cold, requiring honesty. At one stop, a woman carrying a sack of groceries sat across from her and gave a quick measuring glance to the wrench box. At another, 2 men in ski jackets bordered with bright faces and expensive gloves, smelling of wool, peppermint gum, and hotel soap. They spoke about powder conditions as if the mountain had been made for leisure. She lowered her eyes to the floor mat, where melted snow ran in dirty threads toward the seat bolts. The bus let her off near the edge of Telluride a little after noon. From there she walked, not because it was far, but because she needed time to let the place come at her slowly. Telluride sat in its box canyon like a town someone had set carefully into the bottom of a stone drawer. Mountains rose at the end of every street, abrupt and close, with old mining scars still visible beneath the snow, where trees had not fully covered them. The sky was a flat winter blue. Chimneys made brief handwriting above the rooftops. The town was awake in its own layered way. A bakery on Colorado Avenue sent out the smell of yeast and brown butter whenever its door opened. A real estate office displayed photographs of houses lit warmly against snow, each one priced as if shelter itself had become a collector's item. There was a ski rental shop with racks of polished boots in the window, a florist whose buckets held pale roses and eucalyptus, a pharmacy with sun-faded posters taped beside the door, and a diner where a woman in a red apron wiped the same counter twice while watching the street. She passed them all. She looked once into the hardware store and stopped longer than she meant to. The front windows held shovel handles, coils of rope, stovepipe sections, and a rack of work gloves in sizes marked with black ink. A brass bell hung over the door. Inside, someone was cutting chain, the sound sharp and familiar. For a breath, she nearly went in. It seemed possible that a place selling washers, nails, and stove gasket rope might understand a person who had no proper place to stand. But the notice had not said hardware store. It had said county. The county building was less grand than she expected. Brick 2 stories, a flag moving stiffly in the wind. The steps had been salted, leaving white crescents along the edges, and the glass doors wore the fingerprints of many people who had come needing records, licenses, permits, judgments, signatures, or permission. She stood at the bottom of the steps and shifted the wrench box to her other hand. Inside, heat struck her cheeks hard enough to sting. The lobby smelled of floor wax, wet wool, copy paper, and old radiators. A bulletin board stood by the entrance, crowded with notices: road closures, avalanche safety, property tax deadlines, dog licensing, public meeting agendas, lost keys, a church supper, a blood drive. Snowmelt collected in black rubber mats beneath everyone's boots. Somewhere beyond a half wall, a printer ran with a steady mechanical chatter. She found the clerk's office by reading the signs twice. Records. Treasurer. Assessor. Clerk and recorder. The last door was open. Behind the counter sat a woman with white hair pinned close to her head and narrow glasses hanging from a chain against a dark green sweater. She was not large, but everything about her had the settled authority of furniture that had stood in one place for decades. Her shoulders were square. Her mouth was direct. Her nameplate read MRS, Elaine Morrow, County Clerk. There were framed maps on the wall behind her, solder boundaries overlaid with newer ones. A brass seal press sat at the corner of the counter, its handle worn dark where many hands had pressed it down. Beside it was a little wooden tray labelled Received in block letters. The tray was empty. The woman looked over her glasses. "Can I help you?" Her voice did not soften the question, but neither did it sharpen it. "I am here about the surplus notice," the young woman said. Her own voice sounded unused, as though it had been stored somewhere without oil. The former funicular station. Mrs. Morrow did not move for a moment. Then she took off her glasses and laid them on a stack of forms. Which one? The operating station above town? The clerk's eyes went briefly to the wrench box, then to the coat, then to the split knuckles. It was not an unkind inventory, but it was complete. That notice was not meant to attract casual interest. I understand. It is not a cabin. Yes. Ma'am, it has no approved occupancy. Yes. Ma'am, no water. No sewer. No electric service. Yes. Ma'am, it is on a steep approach, and the road is not maintained in winter. Yes. Ma'am, the county's position is that the structure is unsafe. If you assume liability, the liability is yours. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Morrow leaned back slightly. The chair gave a short complaint beneath her. You understand that means if a beam fails, if a roof slides, if a trespasser gets hurt, if you fall through the floor, if you discover contamination, if you cannot secure the site, the county is not coming back to take responsibility for your judgment. The young woman's fingers tightened once around the box handle. Yes, ma'am? The clerk studied her for another few seconds, as if waiting for the fear to arrive late. When it did not, she opened a drawer and removed a manila folder with a red tab. The folder had been handled often along its edges. Inside were printed photographs, an inspection summary, a parcel map, a demolition estimate, and a form whose top line carried the long, plain title of public disposal. Mrs. Morrow turned the folder so it faced the counter. You will read this before signing anything. So she read. She read slowly, not because the words were difficult, but because legal language had a way of hiding the sharpest teeth under the smoothest sentences. She learned that the building had been classified as a former industrial support structure. She learned that its access easement followed an unused service road branching off a county route and crossing a narrow strip of land still held by an old mining concern. She learned that the county wanted no burden of preservation. She learned that demolition had been discussed for years and delayed because no one wished to pay for hauling the winch assembly down the slope. There were photographs attached. A sagged porch, a caved section of gutter, 2 broken windows covered with cloudy plastic, a machinery bay with the heavy winch sitting under layers of dust, grease, and nesting debris. Its drum cable cut and tied off with rusted wire. Her eyes stayed longest on the machine. Mrs. Morrow noticed, "That thing alone weighs more than my car," the clerk said. Or so the inspector claimed. "It has a worm gearbox," she answered before she could stop herself. The clerk's brows lifted. "You know that by looking. Partly. The housing shape. The shaft line. Brake placement." Mrs. Morrow looked again at the wrench box, and this time the glance rested. A man came in asking for a marriage license packet, and the clerk told him to take a number from the little red dispenser. Though he was the only other person in the room, he laughed as if she had made a joke. She had not. He took the number, waited where he was told, and watched the young woman at the counter with open curiosity until Mrs. Morrow turned one page too firmly and he found somewhere else to look. When the reading was done, the clerk set a second form on the counter. The minimum bid is symbolic. The county can accept it because the removal estimate exceeds the land value. You still owe recording fees. I have some. How much? The young woman hesitated. Not enough for a full fee. Mrs. Morrow tapped one finger on the counter. Not impatiently. Counting, perhaps. There is a hardship waiver for certain administrative costs. It is not common in property transfers, but the statute does not forbid it. The young woman said nothing. The clerk took another form from a drawer. You understand this does not make the building sound. Yes. Ma'am. It does not make the road safer. Yes. Ma'am. It does not make winter kinder. Yes. Ma'am. It does not make you less alone up there. The answer came after a pause. Yes. Ma'am. Mrs. Morrow's mouth changed. Not enough to be called a smile. Then sign where I mark. The pen was chained to the counter with a silver bead chain that had been repaired with a twist of wire. The first form took her name. The second took an address she did not have. She stopped there, pen lifted. Mrs. Morrow watched the hesitation and slid over a yellow note. Use the property description as mailing hold for now. We can correct it later if needed. The young woman wrote carefully. The letters looked strange to her on official paper, thin and exposed, as if a name became more fragile when placed before the machinery of government. She signed once, then again, then initialed beside warnings about slope hazards, hazardous materials, snow load, wildlife, abandoned equipment, and no guarantee of title improvements. When she laid the folded bills on the counter, Mrs. Morrow did not pick them up immediately. A 5, 4 ones. The clerk looked at them, then lifted her gaze. That will do. She fed the forms into the copier. She stamped one page with black ink, then another. Finally she placed the deed certificate beneath the brass seal press. Her hand closed on the laver, and the seal came down with a deep, blunt sound that seemed too final for so little money. The paper came back raised with the county mark. There are noises a person remembers because they close a door. There are others because they open one. The brass stamp did both. Mrs. Morrow placed the papers in a large envelope, then drew a map on the back of a sheet from the printer. Her lines were straight, her labels Small Colorado Avenue, Pine Street, the old road beyond the cemetery, a service track curling north, then east, then climbing sharply through scrub oak toward the station. She marked a washout with 3 careful X's. Do not take the lower spur. It looks easier and is not. Stay above the old retaining wall. Yes, ma'am, if there is fresh snow, you will lose the track after the 3rd bend. I can watch the grade. You will watch where water has cut it. The edge goes quick up there. Yes, ma'am. The building sits just below the old tower foundation. You will see the roof first, if the weather is clear. The clerk paused with the pencil still in her hand. What did you say your surname was? The young woman gave it. Mrs. Morrow's fingers stilled. Spell it. She did. The clerk turned, opened a grey file cabinet behind her, and pulled out a card drawer that seemed older than the computer on the desk. She moved through index cards with careful speed. Her face changed only in the way a room changes when a cloud passes from the sun. My father kept maintenance records for the county tram systems, she said. Not the ski lines. Older ones? Mine structures? Service inclines? Emergency cable work. The young woman held still. Mrs. Morrow drew out a card and set it on the counter. It was yellowed at the edges, typed in black, with a handwritten note in blue ink. I knew that name from somewhere. On the card was a service entry from years before. A gearbox inspection, temporary brake repair, cable drum alignment, under mechanic of record, The clerk's father had written a surname that belonged to the man who had taught the young woman how to listen before touching iron. For a moment, the office lost its corners. The copier went quiet. The man waiting for his license packet shifted his weight. Someone laughed down the hall. But the young woman heard only the small remembered knock of a brass oil can placed on a wooden bench, and the old voice telling her that a cover plate did not become correct because one forced it. Mrs. Morrow looked at her over the card. Relative? Yes. Ma'am. He did good work? According to my father. Very particular. Yes, ma'am. The clerk slid the card back into its drawer, but before she closed it, she copied the service date and station reference onto the map in the narrow margin. Might help. Might not. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. The envelope came across the counter. It was heavier than it should have been. Take this directly with you. Keep it dry. And listen carefully now. You're not to enter the machinery bay if the floor gives under your weight. You're not going to stand beneath the cable drum supports until you know what is holding them. You're not going to light any fire unless you have checked the flue from bottom to top. Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Morrow's eyes narrowed slightly. You answer well. That is not the same as obeying. The young woman looked down at the envelope. No. Ma'am? Good. Then you know the difference. Outside, the afternoon had drawn itself tight and clear. The storm had moved east, leaving hard light on the storefront windows and blue shadows at the bases of buildings. She stood on the county steps with the envelope tucked inside her coat and one gloved hand pressed over it. People passed below, carrying skis, paper coffee cups, brown bags, flowers, a roll of drawings under one arm. No one could have seen that anything had changed. No one stopped. No one looked twice. That was a mercy. She turned uphill. The route began in town, but it did not stay town for long. She walked past a church with icicles hanging from the eaves, then past the cemetery where iron fences stood, knee-deep in snow and stone names faced the mountains. Beyond that, houses thinned. A man in a wool cap was splitting kindling beside a shed-painted barn red. He paused mid-swing to watch her go by with the wrench box. A woman carrying firewood from a stacked porch did the same but looked away first. At the edge of the old service road, a yellow sign warned against trespass, though the county map said the easement still held. Beneath it, someone had tied a strip of orange survey tape that snapped softly in the wind. The track climbed between scrub oak and serviceberry, its ruts packed with snow where tires had not gone in weeks. She followed the higher line as the clerk had told her. At the first bend, town slipped partly from view. At the second, her breath began to burn. At the third, she understood why Mrs. Morrow had marked the washout. The road had been bitten open by spring water and neglect. One edge fell away into a steep drainage where alder branches made a black net above stones. She crossed above it, placing each boot where the snow looked least disturbed, using the wrench box as a counterweight. The grocery sack pulled at her shoulder. Once her foot broke through crust and sank to the shin. She stood still until the first clean flare of panic passed, then pulled free slowly, not twisting, not rushing. The mountains watched without comment. A little higher, she passed a long, narrow house with tar paper over one window and stacked firewood under blue plastic. A dog came out from beneath the porch. It was yellow and broad-headed, with one ear torn short. It barked twice, then walked beside her at a distance of 10 feet. Not friendly, not hostile, simply supervising. At the edge of the property line, an older man opened the door and called the dog back. "Leave her be. Hank." The dog stopped, shook snow from its paws, and obeyed. The man raised 2 fingers from the doorway. His beard was white at the chin, his suspenders dark over a thermal shirt. "You going to the winch shed?" She nodded. "Floor's no good on the east side. I will watch it. Roof drops ice after sun. I will watch that too." He looked at her coat, then at the wrench box, then up the road. "Mind the walnut trees. Limbs come down quiet. There were walnut trees farther up, though she had not expected them at that elevation and exposure. They stood around an old spring seep where the ground must have held deeper moisture, their limbs bare and black against the snow, their bark folded into long ridges. A few shells lay under the crust where squirrels had been at work. The trees made the place feel less abandoned than waiting. Something had persisted there despite the slope, despite the cold, despite being forgotten by maps and budgets and committees. The service road narrowed beyond them. She saw the roof first. It appeared through the trees as a dull strip of corrugated metal, rusted in long red-brown runs where snowmelt had found nail holes. Then the wall came into view, then the sign. The building sat on a shelf cut from the mountain, backed against stone and scrub, facing out over the canyon with a stubbornness that seemed almost bodily. It was roughly 28 feet long and 16 feet wide, though the attached machinery bay widened it at the uphill side where the winch drum sat. The siding was weathered pine, darkened by decades of sun, snow, and mineral dust. The corners were trimmed with thicker boards gone grey at the ends. A short metal chimney leaned from the roof above the front room. Its cap bent sideways like a hat after bad weather. The sign hung from 2 rusted chains above the door. Telluride service, incline, upper operating station. Most of the white paint had failed. The letters remained because someone long ago had carved them before painting, and the cuts still held shadow. A smaller metal plate beneath it read "No public access." The lower left corner had peeled away from its screws and tapped once against the siding when the wind moved. The front step was not a step any more, only 2 timbers with snow packed between them. The porch roof sagged toward the left. A broken pulley block hung from a hook near the machinery bay, its sheave frozen at an angle. The main cable line was gone, but 2 guide wheels remained above the bay door, rusted and still, facing the empty air where the incline had once continued down toward town. She stood there for a long time, not because she admired it. Admiration would have been too simple. It was not beautiful in the usual sense. It had no welcoming porch, no lamp in a window, no smoke rising from the chimney, no path shoveled to the door. It looked wounded and exact. A working thing whose work had been taken away. A place built to hold tension, load, friction, weather, and human trust, then left alone after the last person turned a key and did not come back. She set the wrench box down beside the threshold and took out the county envelope. The deed inside was dry. The seal made a raised circle beneath her thumb. The key to the door, according to Mrs. Morrow, had not been found. There was no ceremonial opening, no brass key turning in an aged lock. The latch hung loose where someone had forced it years earlier, and the door itself was held by a length of wire twisted through an eye screw. She untwisted the wire with numb fingers. It broke on the last turn, leaving a rust stain across her glove. The door opened inward about 8 inches and stopped. Something on the floor blocked it. She leaned her shoulder into the boards gently, then stopped when the lower hinge complained. Never force what asks to be understood. The sentence arrived without being called. She set down the grocery sack, took the stubby screwdriver from the wrench box, and worked through the gap until she could move the obstruction aside. It was a fallen strip of interior trim, swollen with damp. Once shifted, the door opened with a long drag across grit. Cold air came out first. Not outside cold, which moved and thinned and carried pine and chimney smoke. This cold was shut-in cold, stored cold, the kind that lived under floors and inside walls. It smelled of dust, mouse nests, old oil, rust, wet wood, and the faint, bitter trace of creosote from a stove that had not been lit in years. Beneath that was another smell, mineral and dark, like water standing in a metal bucket. She waited at the threshold until her eyes adjusted. The front room was narrow and low-ceilinged. A pot-bellied stove stood near the interior wall on a square of cracked tile. One stovepipe elbow had slipped loose and rested at a tired angle. Against the far wall was a built-in bench under 2 windows, both clouded with grime, one crossed with a crack from corner to corner. A wooden desk remained beneath the sign-in board. The board still held faint chalk marks, dates, initials, load counts, weather notes. Perhaps the last ordinary record of days when the station had functioned. On the floor lay paper, mouse droppings, flakes of paint, A broken broom handle, 2 beer cans, a length of chain, and a bird skeleton so delicate it seemed made of thread. The silence was complete enough that she could hear her own coat sleeve brush the doorframe. She stepped inside with one foot and tested the floor. The boards gave, but not too much. She shifted weight slowly, heel to toe. The second step brought a creak from the left, so she went right. She set the wrench box on the desk because the floor near the wall felt stronger. Dust lifted around it in a pale breath. The front room had 3 doors. The one to the left led to a closet with shelves and a rusted first aid box mounted to the wall. The one ahead opened into the machinery bay. The one to the right led into a back room no wider than a pantry, with a sloped ceiling, 2 hooks in the wall, and a narrow built-in bunk frame without a mattress. Someone had once slept there during storms or long shifts. Someone had hung a coat on those hooks, kept boots under that frame, perhaps eaten from a tin plate, while listening to the cable move through the sheaves. The back room window faced the walnut trees. She stood inside it and looked out. Snow had settled along the branches. Beyond them, the canyon opened, and the town sat below with its roofs and streets and lit windows beginning to show. From up here, all human arrangements seemed temporary. Roads, deeds, evictions, names on mailboxes. A person could lose one set of walls and, if she kept walking, come to another that had no reason to accept her except that nobody else had asked. The machinery bay waited behind the middle door. She did not enter it fully that first hour. The floor changed there from plank to heavy timbers and steel plates, some hidden beneath old grease and debris. The winch dominated the bay even in shadow, a drum wide as a dining table, brake bands rusted but intact, a motor mount without the motor. The gearbox sat to one side like a dark shoulder, its cast housing thick, square, and filmed with oil that had gathered dust until it resembled black felt. A hand wheel leaned against the wall. Above it, a set of control levers remained in a slotted iron quadrant, each lever topped with a wooden handle worn smooth by hands no longer living. She smelled grease more strongly there. Cold metal. Pack rat nests. Wind entering somewhere through a seam in the uphill wall. Her fingers wanted to touch the gearbox. She did not let them. First came shelter. She spent the remaining light making a small inventory of what could hurt her before morning. Loose glass, weak boards, open stovepipe, rodent nests, a section of ceiling where water had stained the boards dark. She cleared the front room only enough to lay down cardboard found beneath the desk, then spread her mother's sweater over it, though the sweater was too thin to matter. She pushed the desk against the door because the latch no longer held. She wedged the broken broom handle through the interior pull as a second measure. In the closet she found 3 wax stubs in a tobacco tin, a cracked enamel mug and a coil of wire. In the desk drawer she found a pencil with teeth marks, a ledger too damp to read, and a folded paper packet of matches sealed in a plastic sandwich bag, so old the plastic had yellowed. 2 matches worked. She used one to test the wick of the least ruined candle stub, then cupped the flame with both hands as if sheltering a breathing creature. She did not light the stove. Mrs. Morrow's warning had settled correctly in her. A flue could be blocked with nests, creosote, fallen brick, or a bird that had made the wrong choice in a storm. Fire was not warmth until the path for smoke was known. So she accepted the cold. She sat on the cardboard with her back against the desk and ate the last heel of bread from her sack. It had gone hard at the edges. She broke it into careful pieces and held each one in her mouth until it softened. Water came from the bottle she had filled at the library. It tasted faintly of plastic and chlorine. She drank only half. Night rose from the canyon rather than falling from the sky. First, the walnut trees became black lines. Then the machinery bay disappeared past the open inner doorway, though the winch remained as a greater darkness inside dark. Then the front windows turned reflective, giving her back a dim shape of herself, narrow shoulders under a coat, hair loose from its tie, face hollowed by cold and road wear, one hand resting on the blue wrench box as if it were an animal that might wander off. The building began to speak after dark. Not in mystery. In matter. Metal contracted with small ticks, wind pressed the uphill wall and withdrew. A loose edge of roofing lifted and settled. Somewhere in the machinery bay, a chain link shifted under its own old tension. The desk behind her smelled of damp paper. The floor beneath her hip let out one soft pop when the temperature fell another degree. She listened to each sound until she knew which ones repeated and which did not. That was how she made the room less strange. Near midnight snow began again. She could not see it at first, only hear the changed softness outside, the way the world seemed to draw a quilt over its own mouth. The candle had burned down to a shallow cup of wax in the tobacco tin. She pinched it out before it failed, saving the last fraction of wick. Darkness came fully then, but she did not move. She had slept in worse places. Colder perhaps, though not many, less honest places, certainly. The deed envelope lay inside her coat. The wrench box was under her right hand. The sealed-off machinery bay breathed grease and iron through the open door. She placed the folded county map beneath her head to keep it from damp, drew her knees toward her chest, and listened until the station's noises became numbered and known. Beyond the wall, beyond the walnut trees, beyond the slope where the old incline had once carried ore and men and weather reports up and down the mountain, Telluride kept its lamps burning below. No one came, no one knocked, no one told her to leave. The station had been waiting longer than she had. At dawn, she marked the weak floorboards with pencil crosses before she took 3 steps toward the machinery bay. The pencil came from the desk drawer, worn nearly to the ferrule, its wood chewed by some man who had once kept watch over gauges and weather. She sharpened it with the edge of her pocket knife, catching the curls in her palm because she had already begun to understand that nothing inside the station should be wasted or moved without thought. The first board near the stove gave under heel pressure. The second, by the closet, sounded hollow but held. The third one outside the machinery bay dipped half an inch when she placed the wrench box on it, and that was enough. She drew an X there, then another beside the front window, then 2 along the east wall where old water had darkened the grain. The morning had come grey, snow pressed against the lower edge of the door and made a pale light under the threshold. The front room smelled worse in daylight because daylight made every failure visible, mouse droppings in the corners, damp paper swollen along the desk legs, a line of black mould behind the fallen trim, paint lifting in curled tongues from the sill. Yet the building did not feel more ruined for being seen. It felt more exact. Each problem had a location. Each location could be named. That was useful. She went outside with the empty bottle tucked under her arm and followed the sound of water. The spring seep lay beyond the walnut trees, not a proper well at first glance, only a place where the snow had melted into a dark oval around stones, but 10 paces above it stood a hand pump leaning under a broken wooden cover, its handle tied down with baling wire. She cleared snow from the base with her boot. The pump body was cast iron, green beneath flaking paint, with the maker's name half hidden under rust. She worked the handle once. Nothing came. The leather cup inside was likely dry, cracked, or gone. Beside the pump, half buried in snow, was a square concrete ring with a plank lid. She moved the lid 1 inch, saw black water below, and put it back carefully. A well, then, or a cistern fed by the spring. Not drinkable without boiling. Not yet trusted. But water was water if handled with respect. She filled the bottle at the seep after clearing a little channel through the ice and holding the mouth low, where the flow moved brightest. The cold took her fingers quickly. She capped the bottle, tucked it under her coat to keep it from freezing, and went looking for the outhouse marked faintly on Mrs. Morrow's map. It stood 30 yards uphill behind a screen of scrub oak, listing toward the west like a tired man in wind. The door had no latch. Inside, frost glittered on the seat, and a porcupine had chewed one lower corner of the wall. It was still better than a gas station restroom with a blue light and no lock. She cleared the doorway with a broken shovel found against the back wall and made herself a path, tamping the snow flat in deliberate steps so she could find it after dark. By the end of the first day, she knew the station's nearest necessities. Water from the seep, boiled if she could make fire, waste uphill in the little shed if the path held. Shelter in the front room away from the east wall. Machinery bay only along the central beamline until she understood the floor. No stove until the chimney was known. No sleep without the desk against the door. No panic unless panic could repair something. The second day she learned the sounds. The front door scraped in 2 notes, first wood, then the nail head under it. The roof ticked above the stove after sunrise, then went silent until late afternoon. The broken pulley outside tapped only in a north wind. The machinery bay made one deeper sound near noon, a slow metal settling from the winch frame as the air warmed by a few degrees. The floor beside the desk clicked once each time she put weight near the left rear leg. The closet shelf groaned under nothing at all, which meant either the wall behind it was shifting or an animal had a nest inside. She found the animal whole by kneeling with her cheek near the floor and waiting for draught. Cold air came through a gap no wider than 2 fingers behind the baseboard. She stuffed it with rag strips torn from a ruined shirt in her grocery sack, then wedged cardboard over it. Not permanent. Enough. On the 3rd morning she walked down to town with the wrench box in one hand and the county envelope in the other, because the hardware store had become less a temptation than a requirement. The road down was harder than the road up. Her calves trembled by the second bend. Snow crust broke under the heel and slid underfoot. Twice she caught herself on scrub oak and came away with bark scraped across her palm. At the washout she crossed slowly, eyes on the place where water had eaten beneath the edge. The yellow dog appeared again from the porch below the walnut trees. This time it did not bark. Hank, the old man, called from inside, "Not coming out." The dog watched her pass, then lowered its head to sniff the track she had made. Town was bright with morning traffic and ski boots striking sidewalks. A delivery truck idled outside the bakery. The florist was arranging buckets by colour in the window. The real estate office had changed one of its photographs. Nothing in town admitted that a person could be living without heat above it. The hardware store stood between the pharmacy and a shop selling wool blankets too costly to touch. Its sign read Barker & Son Hardware, though one corner of the sign had been painted over where perhaps the son had left or the name had outlived the arrangement. A bell gave a modest ring when she entered. Warmth met her first. Then the smell of cut wood, fertilizer, oiled steel, rubber boots, old cardboard, pipe dope, paraffin and coffee, left too long on a hot plate. A narrow aisle ran between bins of fasteners labelled by hand. Ceiling hooks held snow shovels, bow saws, lanterns, coils of rope, extension cords, chimney brushes, garden rakes, and 2 pairs of snowshoes with rawhide lacing gone dark at the knots. The floorboards were scarred by years of boot soles and pallet jack. Near the counter stood a glass case filled with pocket knives, brass padlocks, small levels, and sharpened awls. The owner was on a step stool, reaching for a box of copper fittings. He was a broad, spare man in his 60s, with a white moustache trimmed close and eyebrows that made him look sterner than his voice later proved to be. His flannel shirt was buttoned to the throat. His apron had pencil marks down the front where he had wiped his hands without noticing. The name stitched over the pocket read L. Barker. He climbed down slowly when he saw her waiting. "What are you fixing?" It was the first question he asked. Not "what do you need?" Not "can I help you?" What are you fixing? As if repair were the natural state of anyone who crossed his threshold carrying wrenches. The old funicular station above town. His hand paused on the fitting box. County finally gave that burden away. Yes. To you? Yes. He set the fittings on the counter and looked at her with the same complete inventory Mrs. Morrow had made, though his came from another trade. Boots. Coat. Hands. Box. Face. Hunger, perhaps? He did not look away from any of it, but he did not press his thumb into it either. You know that Winch is a dangerous piece of iron. I know enough not to stand under what I have not inspected. That is not the same as enough. No. One eyebrow moved. What is first? Chimney, then door latch, then floor, then water. Good order. She let out a breath she had not meant to hold. He came around the counter and led her through the aisles without asking whether she could pay. That did not make it mercy, it made it more frightening, because mercy often ended at the cash register. He pulled down a stiff-bristled chimney brush, a fiberglass rod set, a small tub of furnace cement, a roll of gasket rope, a hasp, 2 hinge screws, a box of 8-penny galvanized nails, and a brown paper packet of stove polish that looked as though it had been on the shelf since before she was born. He wrote prices on a pad. Brush, $9.89 rods, $14.50 cement, $6.25. Rope, $3.79 by the foot. You do not need more than 4 feet if the stove door is standard. Hasp, $2.98, screws $1.10. Nails, $4.40, stove polish. I will not charge for because I'm tired of seeing it. She watched the numbers gather. I cannot buy all of it today. I did not say today. He tore the paper from the pad, then reached under the counter for a ledger with a green cloth cover. It was not decorative. It had been used hard, corners rounded, spine repaired with tape. He opened to a blank line and wrote the date. I keep house accounts for people who pay when they can. I do not have a house. You have a parcel with a roof in distress. That is close enough for my ledger. She swallowed. I cannot promise fast. I did not ask fast. I can work. I guessed that. The bell rang as someone came in behind her. Mr. Barker lifted one finger to indicate he would be a moment and kept writing. Name. She gave it. He did not react to the surname. Not outwardly. Perhaps Mrs. Morrow had already used up the town's portion of recognition for 1 week. He wrote it carefully, then turned the ledger around and pushed a pencil toward her. Sign here. Not because I think you will run, but because handwriting steadies an agreement. She signed. He looked at the name, then at the blue wrench box. Any experience with chimneys? Only stovepipe. Not a full flue. He reached beneath the counter again and brought out a book with a cracked red cover. Home Repairs for Cold Country Houses. Revised edition, 1/9/78. A library discard stamp marked the inside page. Several chapters had tabs made of masking tape. Take this. Bring it back when you have learned enough to dislike it. I cannot buy that. I did not price it. I should pay something. You will. By not burning down that station. The other customer, a woman buying birdseed, made a quiet sound that might have been laughter or approval. Toby did not look at her. She placed the book in the grocery sack with more care than she had given her own clothes. Miss Barker packed the chimney tools, latch hardware, and nails into a cardboard box that had once held canning jars. He added 2 pairs of work gloves with leather palms. These are used. They look new. Used by being in my way. He wrote nothing for them. At the door, she called after her. Check from the bottom first. If the flue is packed, do not ram it down into the stove. Yes. And tie the brush rope to your wrist if you work from the roof. Yes. And do not work on that roof alone if there is ice. She paused with the box against her hip. I do not have anyone else. He looked at her for a long moment. Then do not work on that roof yet. The climb back took twice as long. The cardboard box cut into her forearms. Halfway up, she set it on a rock and opened and closed her fingers until feeling returned. The grocery sack with the manual pulled at her shoulder. The road was beginning to soften where sun touched it, and each step stole a little energy from the next. By the time she reached the walnut trees, sweat had chilled under her coat. She stood with one hand braced against a trunk and listened to the water under the snow. The station looked no better in afternoon light. That helped. A person could not be betrayed by a building that made no promises. She began with the chimney exactly as the manual advised, though the manual assumed a proper ladder, a helper, a respirator, and a householder with a kitchen. She had none of those. She did have the habit of reading 3 times before touching a mechanism that could punish carelessness. She cleared the cracked tile around the stove, set the enamel mug beneath the loose stovepipe joint to catch falling soot, and removed the elbow section 1 rusted screw at a time. Creosote came down in black flakes. The smell was sharp and tarry, bitter enough to taste. She wrapped a rag around her mouth and nose, then shone the little keychain light she had kept from the tire shop up through the pipe. The beam struck blockage 6 feet above the stove collar. Nest or soot? Probably both. From the bottom she fed 1 rod section upward with the brush attached, turning it clockwise as the manual advised so the joint would not unscrew inside the flue. 3 feet. Then 6. Resistance. She withdrew, cleared the bristles, tried again. The second pass loosened a fall of debris that struck the stoveplate with a dry rush. Soot, pine needles, twigs, a grey feather, and the tiny bones of something that had once trusted the chimney more than it should have. She worked for 2 hours from below. Then she rested. Not a long rest, long enough to drink water, flex her hands and look at the stove as if it were another person in the room whose silence might become useful. The manual's chapter on flues lay open on the desk, weighed by a wrench at one corner. It spoke of draft, clearance, spark arresters, chimney caps, fire brick, negative pressure, and the danger of assuming that smoke understood mercy. By mid-afternoon, she climbed to the roof only as far as the porch overhang and then stopped. The metal above was slick where sun had softened the snow. Mr. Barker's warning stood between her and the higher pitch. She backed down before pride could speak. Instead, she worked from the clean-out door she found at the base of the chimney outside, half hidden behind drifted snow and a nest of dead grass. The clean-out plate was rusted shut. She soaked the screws with oil from Elias's brass can, waited 20 minutes, tapped each screw head with the screwdriver handle to wake the threads, then turned them out slowly. 1 broke. 2 came free. The plate opened on a packed black throat. This time the soot came out by the handful. She used a bent strip of metal as a scraper and the broken broom handle as a probe. Creosote fell in curled flakes, some shiny as coal glass. Behind it came a mass of old nesting material, dry enough to burn like paper if she had lit the stove too soon. She laid everything outside on snow and watched how much danger had been waiting above the place where she had hoped for warmth. Hours passed without ceremony. Her back ached, her wrists went weak, soot settled into the cracked skin around her knuckles until the lines looked drawn in ink. She cleaned, brushed, withdrew, cleared, brushed again. By dusk the brush travelled from stove collar to the upper bend without hard resistance. Not perfect. Passable. Good enough for a test so small it would be almost insult. She waited until morning anyway. That night was colder than the first, because now she knew warmth was possible and had denied it to herself for 1 more night. She read by candle stub until the words blurred. The manual gave instructions for patching plaster, rehanging doors, replacing sash cord, setting glass, mixing mortar, sistering joists and thawing pipes one should have drained before the freeze. It had drawings made by a patient hand. The people in the drawings had clean sleeves and complete sets of tools. She slept with soot in her hair. On the 4th morning, she built the first fire in the pot-bellied stove. She began with 3 twists of paper from the unreadable ledger, not the pages with writing still visible, but the blank rear sheets swollen by damp. Over that she laid slivers shaved from the broken trim, then pencil-thin sticks gathered under the walnut trees where wind had dried them against the trunk. She opened the draft. She warmed the flue first with a candle flame held beneath the collar, as the manual suggested, waiting for the smoke path to remember rising. The match flared. The paper caught reluctantly, then more steadily. The slivers blackened, curled, and took. For 3 long seconds smoke hesitated in the stove belly. Then the flue pulled. The flame straightened. A thread of smoke lifted clean through the pipe and out into the sky. She stood with one hand on the stove door latch, not smiling, not speaking, until heat touched the tips of her fingers. It was not much at first, a small circle of warmth in a room that had stored years of cold, but it changed the sound of the station. Ice loosened along the lower wall. Damp in the floorboards lifted as a faint mineral smell. The stove made little settling pings as its iron expanded. She fed the fire as if feeding an animal too long starved. Never too much, never too fast. Her first hot meal there came from instant noodles cooked in the cracked enamel mug, the handle wrapped with rag so it would not burn her. She used seep water boiled hard for 10 minutes, as the manual recommended in a margin note written by some prior owner. The noodles tasted of salt, smoke, and tin. She ate them sitting on the floor with the mug between both hands. The meal did not fill her. It steadied her. Afterward, she washed the mug with snow and a rag, dried it near the stove, and turned to the workroom because warmth had given her one clear hour before exhaustion claimed the rest. She named the spaces now. Front room, bunk room, closet, machinery bay. Workroom was perhaps too generous, but the corner beyond the winch had a bench under the uphill wall, and a bench made work possible. She cleared a path to it, one object at a time. There was a grease bucket with no lid, hardened across the top into black ridges. A coffee can filled with cotter pins, 3 nails, mouse husks, and 1 good brass washer. A rusted chain fall hung from a ceiling beam, its hook wrapped in rotten cloth. 2 wooden wedges lay under the bench. A cracked oilstone sat in a tin with dried mud inside it. There was a box of carbon brushes for a motor no longer present, a coil of frayed cable, a broken voltmeter, a bundle of rags gone stiff, and 3 spanner wrenches hanging on pegs. The pegs mattered. Someone had made a place for tools and expected them to return there. She took inventory on the back of an inspection notice, not because anyone had asked, because naming what remained made the station less abandoned. Spanner wrench, large bent jaw. Spanner wrench, medium, usable after cleaning. Spanner wrench, small cracked handle. Grease gun, empty. Oil can, missing spout. Brake lining fragments. Cotter pins, mixed. Shim stock, 3 pieces. Lantern, no globe. Fuse block, obsolete. Porcelain insulator, chipped. Control lever quadrant, intact but frozen. Then the winch. She approached it as Elias would have expected, from the outside inward, refusing the hand's urge to touch the most interesting part first. The drum was rusted but not deeply pitted where the cable had once protected the surface. The brake bands were locked, perhaps by corrosion, perhaps intentionally. The worm shaft input coupling had been disconnected when the motor came out. The output housing was heavy cast iron with inspection plates along the side, each held by slotted machine screws large enough to require a proper driver. The oil level plug sat low on the casing, sealed under grease. On top of the gearbox, someone had left a cedar disc. At first she thought it was a lid from something, perhaps the bottom of an old tobacco tin or a wooden plug used to cover an opening. It was about 5 inches across, darkened by oil and dust, lying flat on a ledge behind the inspection cover. Cedar did not belong there, too soft for shimming, too porous for machinery, too deliberate to be trash. She did not move it yet. She tapped the gearbox housing with the handle of the screwdriver, once near the input shaft, once near the lower sump, once along the inspection plate. The cast iron answered deep and dull, as expected from a box full of congealed oil. Then she tapped beneath the cedar disc. The note changed. Not hollow. Not exactly. Separated. She tapped again. Softer. The difference was slight enough that someone sweeping the room would never hear it. But to a person raised on bad bearings and hidden cracks, it stood out like one wrong heartbeat in a known rhythm. She went still. Sound first. Sight next. Wait after. She brushed the dust from around the cedar disc with 2 fingers and saw that it covered not an opening, but a circle of cleaner grease beneath its edge. The disc had protected that spot for a long time. There were no screw heads visible, no pull ring, no label. She lifted the disc with the tip of her pocket knife. It resisted only because oil had glued it down. Under it was a round steel plug set flush into the casting. The plug had 2 small holes drilled opposite each other, like the face of a pin spanner nut. Not a standard inspection point. Not a drain. Someone had machined access into the gearbox housing and hidden it beneath a piece of cedar darkened to match neglect. Her mouth went dry. She stood and walked out to the front room. The stove was still drawing. The water bottle sat beside it. The county envelope lay under the desk drawer where she had hidden it from drafts and mice. Nothing in the room had changed. The broken window remained broken. The weak floorboards remained marked. The station did not announce anything. She returned to the gearbox with the medium spanner wrench from the peg. It did not fit. The holes in the plug were closer together than the wrench pins. She tried the small spanner, too loose. The bent large one was useless. She could make a tool, but not in haste. So she took 2 sixpenny nails from the hardware box, filed their points flat against the oilstone until her wrist hurt, clamped them in the jaws of an adjustable wrench from the blue box, and bound them in place with copper wire stripped from the obsolete fuse block. It was ugly. It was honest. It might turn once. Before turning, she cleaned. She scraped hardened grease from around the plug with a sliver of wood. She wiped the holes clear with rag wrapped around a nail. She touched oil from Elias's brass can to the seam and waited. The plug had slept there longer than she had been alive. Threads deserved time before being asked to move. Half an hour later, she set the improvised pins into the holes and leaned carefully. Nothing. She did not force it. She tapped the wrench handle once with the heel of her hand. Then again. She shifted her grip, pressed downward to keep the pins seated, and gave steady pressure until the muscles along her forearm began to shake. The plug moved with a sound no louder than a tooth cracking. Then another fraction. Then it turned. She stopped after the first quarter turn, backed it slightly, added oil, and turned again. Grit rose in the threads. The plug fought every inch. Twice the wire binding slipped, and she had to reset the nails once her knuckle struck the casting and opened fresh blood into the old soot lines. She wiped the blood on her jeans and kept working because blood was less important than keeping the tool square when the plug finally came free. It did not reveal oil. Behind it was another surface, dark rubber or tar-coated metal, set 2 inches back within the hole. A sealed cap. She touched it with the screwdriver tip. It gave slightly, like a gasket under pressure. Now the weight test. The plug itself was heavier than expected. Solid steel, machined with care. She set it on the bench and looked into the opening. The chamber behind it could not be large unless it extended along a hidden passage in the casing, but she had tapped separation in the housing. Someone had known the internal voids of the gearbox well enough to create a dry compartment inside a machine designed to hold oil. That was not accident. That was intention by a patient hand. She used the pocket knife to lift the inner cap. It held at first, then came away with a sticky sigh. No smell of old gear oil followed it. Instead came the faint scent of rubber, paper, and something mineral, sealed away from air. Inside the chamber was a waterproof metal box wrapped in waxed canvas. It took 20 minutes to remove. The opening was narrow, the box had been fitted exactly, and old rubber had gripped its sides. She made a hook from wire, worked it behind the handle, and drew it forward a 1/4 inch at a time, resting whenever impatience began to rise. When it finally slid free into both hands, its weight surprised her so sharply she nearly dropped it on the gearbox housing. It was the size of a lunch pail, rectangular, painted dark green, with a gasketed lid and 2 latches taped closed with cloth tape gone brown. Letters stenciled on one side were nearly rubbed away, but she could make out waterproof document case, U.S. Army Signal Corps, Type CS-34. Beneath that, in white paint applied by hand, someone had written mountain drawings, "Do not discard." She carried it to the front room and set it on the desk. The stove had burned down to coals. Afternoon light lay narrow across the boards. Outside, a raven spoke once from somewhere above the roofline, then went silent. Toby stood with both hands on the desk edge, breathing through her nose because her hands had begun to shake, and she did not want to make a ceremony of trembling. She opened the latches one at a time. The gasket broke its long seal with a soft pull. On top lay oilcloth folded around a bundle of papers. She lifted it out and set it aside. Beneath it was a second package, wrapped in brown waxed paper and tied with cotton string. Beneath that lay a flat tin box, 2 canvas bank bags, and a small velvet pouch tied with black cord. The interior of the case was dry as a drawer in a heated room. The air that came from it seemed older than the dust in the station, but cleaner, held apart. She opened the papers first because the hand trusts paper before money. They were blueprints. Not one drawing, but many, folded with engineer's discipline and marked along their edges in white drafting ink. Plan of Telluride service, incline upper station, longitudinal section, north slope spur, cable anchor foundation detail, drainage map, spring line and subsurface flow, winch gearbox modification, hidden dry compartment, revision B, emergency lowering brake assembly, rock shelf survey, access easement and maintenance route. The mountain was drawn inside them, not as scenery, as load, pitch, drainage, bearing strata, timber cribbing, anchor points, danger, and path. Whoever had folded these papers had understood that a mountain was not a backdrop. It was a structure older than any building placed upon it, and every nail driven into it borrowed permission. She spread one blueprint on the floor, weighting its corners with wrenches. The lines were pale against blue, precise and patient. There was the station footprint there, the gearbox, there the spring seep. There the walnut trees marked simply as mature trees, preserved for soil hold. There the washout as a drainage channel predicted decades before neglect opened it fully. There, along the slope below, were ghost lines of towers, footings and cable path no longer visible from the road. In the margin of one sheet, written by hand, was a note: if this station passes from use, drawings must remain with structure. A machine without its memory becomes a hazard. She read the sentence once, then sat back on her heels. The second package held tools. Not many, not enough to outfit a shop, but each had been chosen by someone who expected a careful inheritor rather than a lucky finder. A star at machinist's level wrapped in oiled cloth, a brass plumb bob with a steel point, a set of feeler gauges older and finer than her own every blade present, a small micrometer in its wooden case, its thimble still turning cleanly after years sealed in darkness, a hand scraper with a polished handle, 3 shim envelopes labelled .003, .005, and .010, a stub of layout chalk wrapped in paper. A folded note in block letters said, "For alignment before power. Never trust eyes alone." She touched the micrometer case with 2 fingers and then withdrew them. There are tools that belong to anyone who buys them. There are tools that carry the hand of the person who used them correctly for so long that the handle becomes a kind of testimony. These were the second kind. They did not feel valuable in a shop window way. They felt kept. The flat tin box contained documents, photographs, and a sealed envelope addressed not to a person by name, but to the next one who can hear the machinery. She did not open the envelope. Not yet. The handwriting on it was narrow and black, with downward strokes so steady they seemed ruled. A person did not write those words for curiosity. A person wrote them to be read when the finder had enough quiet around her to receive what was being given. She placed the envelope back in the tin and closed the lid. Then she opened the canvas bank bags. The first held bills, old but not ancient, mostly hundreds banded in paper sleeves from a bank whose Telluride branch no longer existed. The bands were yellowed but legible, 10,000, 10,000, 5,000. She counted on the desk, not quickly, not trusting the printed bands until her own fingers had verified them. The bills made a dry whisper as they moved. She stacked them in rows of 20. The second bag held more bills, and beneath them, coin rolls wrapped in brittle paper, $half, silver dollars, quarters from before the date when silver left common hands. Some rolls had been opened and rewrapped with string. There was also a small leather purse containing loose coins. Mercury dimes, Walking Liberty halves, 3 Morgan silver dollars worn smooth at the cheek, and one 1921 peace dollar that had been carried enough to lose its sharpness. She counted everything twice. $50,073. The odd cents sat by themselves near the edge of the desk, 2 quarters, 2 dimes, 3 pennies dark with age. She did not understand why the cents mattered, but someone had included them, and therefore they were counted with the rest. Not rounded away, not dismissed. The velvet pouch held a medal. It was not polished. A dark ribbon lay folded around it, frayed at one end. The bronze star at its centre had dulled where fingers once touched it. The back was engraved with a name, a unit, and the year 1944. Wrapped with it was a military discharge paper, fragile at the creases, and a photograph of a young man standing beside the funicular station in summer, one hand resting on the winch frame, his cap pushed back, his face serious in the way of people who have not yet learned what will be asked of them. Toby placed the medal beside the coins and did not touch it again. Even alone. Certain things required manners. Evening came without her noticing. The stove had gone cold. The room had darkened. The blueprints on the floor had become a patch of deeper blue under shadow, and the money on the desk had lost its colour, becoming only shapes arranged by a hand too tired to keep counting. She should have felt rich. Instead, she felt the building become heavier around her. Money was a tool, and tools could hurt people who mistook them for rescue. The bills would not fix a roof by themselves. They would not clear the flue, mend glass, strengthen joists, teach the road to hold, or make the mountain gentle. They would not return Elias's shed or her father's voice or her mother's lowered eyes. They could make certain purchases possible. They could buy time if guarded. They could make a careful repair more likely. That was enough. Enough could be large if a person did not waste it. She packed the bills back into their canvas bags, the coins into their rolls and purse, the medal into its velvet pouch. She placed the blueprints in their oilcloth, making sure the folds followed the old creases. She set the sealed envelope from the tin on the desk, then moved it to the top of the case, then moved it back into the tin again. No, not that night. Her hands were too cold and too dirty. Her thoughts moved too fast. The station had given her more in one afternoon than she could carry without setting some of it down. A letter deserved mourning. A letter deserved water boiled for coffee, if coffee could be found, hands washed, stove lit, light coming through the window. A letter deserved a person who was not half-starved and afraid of dreaming the whole thing. She closed the waterproof case but did not return it to the gearbox. Not yet. Instead, she lifted one loose board beneath the built-in bench where the floor sounded solid and slid the case into the space below, then covered it with the board, the ruined ledger, and the folded sweater. It was not safe in any formal sense. It was hidden from a casual eye that would have to do until she made a better plan. Outside, the evening had cleared. She took the bottle and walked past the walnut trees to the spring seep. Snow shone faintly under the first stars below. Telluride held its lights close in the canyon, each window a small human square against the dark. Above, the old cable path vanished into timber and stone. Somewhere water moved under ice, steady as breathing, not hurried by discovery, not impressed by money, not silenced by abandonment. She stood there until the cold entered her boots and climbed. Then she knelt, broke the thin skin of ice with a stone, and filled the bottle. The station had been waiting longer than she had. Morning came clear enough for the mountains to enter the room. Light moved through the cracked window in narrow winter bars and settled across the desk, the stove, the pencil-marked floorboards, and the tin box she had refused to open the night before. Toby had slept in pieces. Once the roof had snapped from cold and she had woken with one hand already on the wrench box. Once a mouse had moved inside the wall near the closet. Once, just before dawn, the wind had come up the slope and pressed the station until every nail seemed to remember being driven. She rose without speaking. The stove accepted kindling more easily now. The flue took the smoke with a clean upward pull. And when the first heat came, she set water in the enamel mug and washed her hands in a basin made from the bottom half of a plastic jug she had found under the bench. Soot lifted slowly from the lines around her knuckles. Old grease did not surrender. Blood at one scraped place had dried black. She cleaned until the water went grey, then wiped her fingers on the least dirty piece of cloth she owned. The letter waited on the desk. She took it from the tin box and turned it over once. The envelope had been sealed with brown glue, not wax. The paper was thick, cream-coloured, and kept flat all those years by the waterproof case. Across the front, in steady black handwriting, were the words she had already seen to the next one who can hear the machinery. She knew that hand, not the person, not the name, but the discipline of it. The downward strokes held firm pressure. The loops were narrow because the writer did not waste motion. The spacing was exact, yet not cold. It resembled the notes Elias had made in margins of service manuals when he wanted some future mechanic to understand that a certain bolt must be loosened before another was turned. It was writing made by someone who expected to be gone. She opened the envelope along its upper seam with her pocket knife, following the old line carefully so the paper would not tear. Inside were 6 pages folded once, all written front and back except the last. The first sentence stood alone at the top. My dear one, whoever you are, I do not know your name, and because of that I must begin with trust. If this letter has come into your hands, then either the station has been abandoned long enough for fools to call it useless, or else one careful soul has noticed what others walked past. I have hidden this case inside the main winch gearbox, because men who do not listen to machines will never look for memory there. Grease is a good disguise. So is poverty. So is a building that has been left to lean in weather. My name is Clara Mae Rook Whitcomb. I was born in RA in 1916, when snow still cut off whole valleys and a woman could know the sound of every wagon and truck that passed her door. I'm writing this on September 18th, 1979, from a rented room in Durango, where Dr. Samuel Ives at Mercy Hospital has told me the tumour is in my lung and has gone too far for cutting. He said 6 months in a voice that tried not to be too exact. I appreciated the effort, but I have lived long enough among hoists and bearings to prefer measurements, even hard ones. This station was never mine in the way a deed says mine. It was mine in the way work becomes kin after enough winters. My grandfather Tomasz Rukowski came from Galicia in 1882 and changed the name to Rook because the mine boss could not spell what he did not care to learn. He carried a carpenter's rule, a blacksmith's hammer, and one photograph of his mother standing beside a pear tree. His son, Abel Rook, born in Telluride in 1889, learned cable work from Cornish miners and taught himself drafting by copying patent drawings under lamplight. Abel's daughter, Ruth Ann Rook, my mother, born in 1894, kept accounts for 2 ore companies before women were invited to touch such ledgers, and she could calculate load and grade in her head while men were still reaching for paper. I was her daughter, Clara Mae, and the first girl in our family allowed to carry tools openly instead of under an apron. We were not important people, I want that understood. We did not own the mountain, and we did not grow rich from the ore that came down it. We repaired what moved, braced what sagged, greased what cried out, and stood back when dynamite spoke. But there is a kind of inheritance that does not appear in probate. It passes in the angle of a file, the way a hand rests before turning a screw, the patience to clean a part before judging whether it has failed. The upper operating station was built in 1907 as part of a private ore incline serving claims above the canyon. My grandfather helped set the first anchor timbers before the concrete cured properly, and Abel cursed him for it every spring because frost pushed those timbers out of line. By 1931 the ore work had thinned, and the incline was used more for maintenance than profit. By 1942, when war work took men away and steel became a matter of the nation, we used it mostly for hauling equipment, medical supplies in storms, and once a coffin down after the lower road washed out. Machines remember those things, though owners do not. The trade closed for us on November 3rd, 1949. I write the date plainly because silence is too often built around dates nobody will name. That morning the lower cable anchor failed during an ice storm. No passengers were on the car, thanks be to God, but the empty platform ran wild for 90 feet before the emergency brake caught and tore half its lining away. The company blamed weather. Weather did its part, as it always does. But the truth was deferred maintenance, hidden cracks, and a superintendent who preferred paint over inspection because paint could be shown to investors. After that, the incline was condemned for public use. They stripped the motor, sold the better cable, and left the station to maintenance crews, then to boys with bottles, then to weather. I stayed another 30 years in silence. That was not bravery. It was partly stubbornness and partly shame. My husband, Daniel Whitcomb, came home from the Pacific in 1945 with a cough that never left him and dreams that woke him before dawn. My brother Andrew Rook did not come home from the Ardennes in 1944. The medal in this case was sent to my mother in a small government box with his name spelled correctly, which was more mercy than many received. My son Joseph served in Korea and returned with one foot that pained him in snow until the day his truck went off Red Mountain Pass in 1962. After that I had no child to teach and no appetite for begging men to keep a trade they considered obsolete. Still, I could not let the drawings go. A machine without its memory becomes a hazard. So does a family. So does a country, though that is a larger subject than one dying woman should attempt in a letter. If you mean to work on the winch, do not begin with romance. Begin with dirt. Scrape the housing clean enough to read casting seams. Drain nothing until you have warmed the case gradually, no hotter than a hand can bear against the iron. Old gear oil in this box is not ordinary oil now. It will have settled into tar and wax. Use kerosene only in small quantities and never near open flame. Mark every shim before removal. If the worm shaft end play exceeds 12 thousandths, do not power the drum. If backlash is less than 6 thousandths after cleaning, something is binding, and force will break what patience might save. The brake bands must be relined before load. Use woven lining, not molded automotive strip, and set clearance with a feeler gauge cold. Then again after the first warm test. Do not trust the old anchor bolts unless you have cleaned the threads and sounded the concrete around them with a hammer. A clear ring is hope, a dull thud is warning. The mountain drawings will tell you where water moves. Believe them. Water is the slowest vandal and the most faithful witness. The spring above the walnut trees feeds beneath the shelf, and if its channel is blocked, the floor will rot from below while the boards still look sound from above. Keep the drainage open. Preserve the walnut trees if they live. Their roots hold more than soil. If you find money here, and you have, use it as a brace, not a banner. I put aside wages, war bonds, sale proceeds from Daniel's tools, and what remained after Joseph died. I counted $50,000 and 73 cents into the bags because 73 cents was the price of the first pound of nails my grandfather bought on account in Telluride, and my mother kept the receipt all her life. That little debt paid late and with respect seemed a proper number to leave. Spend what keeps the place alive. Guard the rest from pride. If you're hungry, eat. If the roof fails, buy shingles. If winter comes through the windows, set glass. But do not let money convince you that speed is virtue. Slow repair teaches the hand what ownership cannot. There is one more thing. If you're young, you may believe inheritance is something others give or withhold. That is only partly true. People can steal papers, they can sell tools, they can burn letters, they can let a name fall out of speech, but no one can take from you the hour you spend learning how a thing truly works. No one can spend the patience stored in your own hands. No one can evict you from a skill once it has entered the body. If you are old, you may think it is too late to receive what should have come earlier. I tell you it is not. Late bread still feeds. Late shelter still warms. Late truth still tells the truth. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Clara Mae Rook Whitcomb, September 18th, 1979. Toby read the letter once without moving. The stove ticked beside her. Water in the enamel mug gave off a little thread of steam, then stopped. Outside, the walnut trees lifted their bare branches against the morning, and the snow under them had gone blue where shade held. The room seemed to draw away from her in all directions, not becoming empty, but making space for the dead woman's words to stand. She turned back to the first page and read it again. This time she stopped where the names appeared. Tomasz, Abel, Ruth Ann, Clara Mae. Not because she understood the full map of blood and teaching that might connect them to Elias. But because she recognized the way some families keep the useful parts of love in their hands when language fails, Rook, the old mechanic from Ridgeway, had carried that name. He had carried the trade, he had brought her to a bench every other weekend, and placed damaged parts before her without pity. The letter did not prove she belonged. It did something quieter. It refused to say she did not. When she finished the second reading, she folded the pages along their original creases, pressing each line with the side of her thumb, so the paper would not learn a new wound from her hands. She slipped them back into the envelope, then took them out again because hiding them too quickly felt like turning away from a person still speaking. At last she placed the letter on the desk beneath the machinist's level and sat with both palms flat on either side of it. Her face did not change much. A person who had slept under bridges learned that the body could hide weather. But her right hand, the one nearest the letter, opened and closed once on the tabletop as if feeling for a tool no longer there. After a while, she stood. The letter had mentioned the walnut trees and the spring line. It had mentioned water as witness. It had not mentioned any marker directly, but tucked into the tin box with the photograph was a narrow strip of paper she had not noticed the night before. On it in the same writing were 4 words and a small drawing. Horseshoe in walnut trunk. She carried the strip outside. The day had sharpened. Snow on the road threw back light hard enough that she had to lower her eyes. Her boots broke through the crust near the spring, and cold water seeped into one sole, but she kept walking from tree to tree, looking not at the ground but at the trunks. The first walnut had been split by old lightning and healed around the scar in heavy ridges. The second leaned over the seep. The third stood a little apart, larger than the rest, with one lower limb sawn off long ago and bark folded over the cut like a closed mouth. There, half swallowed by the wood, was a horseshoe. It had been nailed to the trunk when the tree was younger, perhaps much younger. The iron had sunk nearly flush as the walnut grew around it. Only the outer curve remained visible, dark and pitted, holding a rim of snow in its lower bend. 2 nail heads showed. The rest had disappeared into living wood. Toby put her palm against the trunk below it. The bark was cold, ridged and dry. Nothing opened. No secret compartment appeared. No hidden drawer slid out. It was only a mark, a patient one left by someone who understood that trees kept records differently than paper. The walnut had not rejected the iron. It had grown around it, changing shape without surrendering its own life. She stood with her hand there until the wind moved through the branches and sent a scatter of powder across her sleeve. Back inside, the station smelled of warm iron and damp boards. She added 2 sticks to the stove, careful not to overfeed it, then took from the tin a small object wrapped in cloth at the very bottom. She had mistaken it for packing. It was not. The cloth opened around a beeswax candle, thick and yellow, its wick blackened at one end but unburned beyond the first quarter-inch. A paper band around it read Christmas Eve, 1919. Ruth Ann saved this for a storm. The candle had survived longer than many houses. She set it in the tobacco tin, touched a match to the wick and waited. Old beeswax did not catch at once. The flame worried the wick, bent low, then steadied. A faint honeyed smell entered the room, almost hidden beneath smoke and soot and gear oil. The light it gave was warmer than the daylight, smaller, less useful, and for that reason more human. She placed it on the desk beside the letter. The flame made the handwriting seem to move. For a long time she did nothing else. No counting. No planning. No deciding how much could be spent or hidden or saved. She only sat on the floor with the letter above her, the candle burning in its tin, the stove working carefully, and the mountain holding its weight around the station. The mind, when it has been struck by more than it can speak, begins gathering small things first. Marlene, with the paper cup of coffee held low behind the cafe, pretending a mistake had been made. The mechanic outside Auray, paying more than the task was worth and looking away so she could take it. The old man at the church rummage table placing wool socks beside her hand without using the word charity. The farmer with the lantern, asking only whether she would leave clean, then giving her an egg warm enough to carry in a pocket, Mrs. Morrow, sliding over the hardship form as if it were ordinary. Mr. Barker, writing her name into a ledger before she had earned the trust of a single board in the station. None of them had saved her in the large way stories often prefer. No one had arrived with a house key, a cheque, a soft bed, an answer. They had given what could be given without making a spectacle of her need. Coffee, socks, work. A warning, credit. A road drawn on paper. Small hinges on which a life might turn without calling attention to itself. She looked at the candle, and its flame leaned once in a draught she had not yet found. If you're watching this tonight from your own kitchen, your chair, your bed, or maybe from a room that feels too still, you may remember a kindness that seemed small when it arrived. Someone who drove you farther than they had to. Someone who put food in your hands without asking you to explain hunger. Someone who spoke to you as if you were still a whole person when the world had begun using smaller names. If one comes to mind, write it down somewhere. Say the name if you know it. Some kindnesses are never repaid in the direction they came from. They travel on by being noticed, then carried carefully into the next cold room. Toby did not have those words for herself. She had only the list of names and the way her hand moved toward the pencil. On the back of the county envelope, in the blank space beside Mrs. Morrow's map, she wrote each one she could remember, not in order of importance, not with any promise attached, just names. Marlene, plough truck mechanic, R.A., church socks man, farmer near Norwood. Mrs. Morrow, L. Barker. When she finished, she set the pencil down and flexed her fingers, because writing had become harder than turning the steel plug. The candle burned steadily for 21 minutes before she pinched it out. She did not let it spend itself all at once. By afternoon, clouds had gathered over the ridge and the station darkened early. She wrapped the letter back in its envelope, then wrapped the envelope in oilcloth and placed it in the waterproof case with the blueprints, the tools, the money, the medal, and the photograph. The case was too important to leave under a bench now. Yet there was nowhere worthy of it. Worthiness would have to wait. Security would have to do. She removed the lower desk drawer, found a cavity behind it where the back panel had warped loose, and slid the tin box there. The canvas bags went beneath the bench again, this time tucked behind a cross-brace. The blueprints she kept near the desk, because weather and water would have to be understood before any true repair began. The medal she placed by itself on the upper shelf of the closet, wrapped in velvet and away from tools. When the work was done, she swept the front room. Not all of it, not even well. But she made a clean rectangle before the stove, moved debris to one corner, and shook dust from the cardboard where she slept. Each motion was modest. Each motion answered the letter more honestly than any speech could have done. That night she did not read again. She set the machinist's level, the brass plumb bob, and Elias's oil can beside the cardboard bed. Not under the bench, not in the box, not across the room. Beside her, where a child might place a toy or a traveller might keep a passport. She laid the folded sweater over her knees and rested one hand near the tools. The stove burned low. The wind moved along the roofline. In the machinery bay, the winch stood in shadow, no longer merely abandoned iron, but a thing with a memory inside it, a thing that had kept faith in Greece and silence long after people had stopped deserving such care. Before sleep took her, Toby turned her head toward the desk where the letter had lain all day. She did not thank the room. She stayed. On December 3rd. Snow came down 7 inches before noon and turned the roof into a test she could no longer postpone. It began before daylight, a dry whisper against the metal that woke Toby from the floor with one hand already reaching for the stove draft. By the time the room had taken its first weak warmth, the windows were white at the corners, and the front door dragged against a ridge of powder when she opened it. Snow had gathered in the low places of the corrugated roof and along the sagging porch cover, where the old metal dipped enough to hold weight instead of shedding it. She stood outside with her coat collar up, looking not at the whole roof but at the lines within it. Ridge. Eave. Sag. Fasteners. Open seams. The manual called this the beginning of judgment, Do not admire the problem. Measure it. So she measured. The main roof ran 28 feet by 16, with a modest pitch and 2 patched places where older sheets had been laid over failing ones. The porch cover added 6 feet by 8, though its left beam had settled enough that replacing the metal without correcting the support would only dress a broken bone. The machinery bay roof was lower, almost flat in one corner where snow had already begun making a shallow bowl above the gearbox wall. She copied the dimensions twice in pencil. Then she read the roofing chapter 3 times. The first reading told her what had to happen. The second reading told her what could kill her if she hurried. The third reading showed her the sentences she had skipped because she wanted the work to be simpler than it was. Underlayment over sheathing. Drip edge before shingles at eaves after underlayment at rakes. Flashing around the chimney. Chalk lines. Staggered seams. Nail placement. Venting if there was an attic, which there was not. Fall protection, which she did not have. A helper, which she did not expect. She took the notes to Mr. Barker. He looked at the paper over his glasses, then looked at her. You are not putting asphalt over rotten decking. No. What is rotten? Porch left corner. Machinery bay uphill edge. Maybe 2 boards above the stove. Maybe is not a measurement. No. He handed the paper back. They worked the numbers on the counter between bins of carriage bolts and stove rope. For the roof she chose 3-tab asphalt shingles because they were cheaper, lighter than metal panels she could not haul safely, and forgiving enough for a hand still learning. 6 bundles would cover the main roof if waste stayed low, 2 more for the machinery bay and porch, 30-pound felt, 1 roll, drip edge, 12 10-foot lengths, roofing nails, 1 1/4 inch, galvanized 5-pound box, 1 tube of roofing cement. Chimney flashing pieces, he said, would not fit properly, but could be coaxed if she cut and bent carefully. 2 8-foot 2x6s for sistering the bad porch rafter. 1 12-foot plank to replace the worst section near the machinery bay wall. He wrote prices in the ledger. She watched without speaking. Do not make that face, he said. I did not know I had. You do. I can carry some up today. You can carry felt, nails, cement, and the hatchet. What hatchet? Mr. Barker went to the back room and returned with a roofing hatchet whose handle had gone dark from years of hand oil. The head was square-faced on one side, blade on the other, with a little gauge cut into the metal for shingle exposure. It had not been used in some time, but it had been kept sharp. My brother's, he said. She looked from the tool to him. I should not take that. He has been gone 12 years. Tool has been hanging where I can argue with it. Better it argues with shingles. I can bring it back every night. You can keep it until the roof no longer leaks. The words had to be handled carefully, so she handled them with both hands. Thank you. He looked away first. Do not thank a hatchet. Keep your thumb clear. The helper came the next morning without introduction. Toby was sweeping snow from the porch timbers when an elderly man climbed the service road at a slow but steady pace. Carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder and a thermos under one arm, he wore a dark watch cap, patched canvas pants, and a canvas coat stiff with old tar. His face was narrow, weathered into long vertical lines, and his eyes were pale enough that they seemed to have borrowed colour from snow. He stopped 10 feet below the station and looked up at the roof for a full minute. Barker said you had a full roof. Toby held the broom upright. Yes. Name's Harold Pike. Toby Bell. Do not call me sir. Makes me look around for my father. All right. He came up the last few steps and set the thermos on the porch. I roofed 39 years. Knees quit. Eyes did not. I cannot pay properly. I did not ask. I need to say that before. Already heard it. Barker told me. She waited. Harold looked at the sagging left edge. I do not climb steep anymore. I can mark. I can cut. I can tell you when you're making it worse. That would help. That will hurt your feelings. She looked at the roof, probably not as much as falling through. He made a short sound that might have been approval. They worked 11 days, not all complete days, because wind stopped them twice and sleet stopped them once, Harold arrived most mornings after the sun cleared the ridge, carrying the same thermos and a canvas pouch of tools. He accepted no chair indoors until the third day, and even then only after he had told her the stove draft was set wrong and corrected it with the end of his cane. His teaching style was not generous in word count. "That nail's proud." She looked. "Pull it." She pulled. Line wandered. She snapped the chalk line again. Too near edge. She shifted the shingle. 3 strokes. She drove the nail in 4. He said nothing, only looked at the hammer. She pulled the nail and did it again. The porch rafter came first. The old beam had not failed completely, but water had softened its upper edge where roof metal leaked for years. Harold showed her how to sister the new 2x6 alongside it. Jack the sag no more than a 1/4 inch at a time with a short post and wedge, clamp the new board tight, drill pilot holes, then fasten with carriage bolts staggered so the grain would not split. She tightened each nut with a box wrench from Elias's set, feeling the new timber drawer against the old. "You do not erase age," Harold said. "You give it something honest to lean on." He did not repeat the sentence. He did not need to. On the main roof, she learned how snow could lie about surface and depth. A crust that looked firm could hide water beneath it. A dry patch could be slick as glass where sun had warmed and refrozen the metal. She kept rope around her waist, tied not to courage but to the uphill anchor post Harold trusted only after testing it with a pry bar and contempt. He stayed below or on the lower pitch, calling instructions while she worked along chalk lines. They stripped failing sheets, patched the worst decking, and laid felt in courses that overlapped by the width of Harold's hand. "Not your hand." "Mine?" She looked at his hand, large-knuckled and bent. "Your hand changes the code?" "My hand remembers rain." The roofing hatchet fit differently from any hammer she had owned. The blade side trimmed shingles against a board guide. The hatchet face drove nails with a flat, decisive note when struck correctly. Harold made her practice on scrap until each nail seated flush without cutting the shingle mat. Proud nail cuts above, deep nail fails below. "Flush," she said. "Flush." The 3-stroke nail became a rhythm. Tap to place, strike to set, strike to finish. No wild swinging. No anger. The tool did not reward force for its own sake. It rewarded alignment. At midday they ate inside, seated on overturned crates near the stove. Harold brought hard cheese wrapped in wax paper and dark bread sliced thick. Toby tried to give him half a package of noodles in return. He accepted them solemnly, then left them on the shelf when he went, which was his way of refusing without making her carry the refusal. By mid-December, the main roof had a clean dark surface and straight courses. The porch no longer sagged like an injured shoulder. The machinery bay roof still bore scars where old fastener holes had been patched, but water would no longer pour down the uphill wall with every thaw. On the last afternoon, Harold stood in the service road and looked at the roof from 3 angles. "It will do." From him, it sounded like a blessing with the paint scraped off. He lifted the thermos, tucked his coil of rope over his shoulder, and started downhill before she could make a speech he would dislike. At the first bend, she stopped without turning. "Clear the valleys after wet snow." "I will." "Do not trust March." "I will not." He raised one hand, not quite a wave, and went on. That evening snow slid from the new shingles in clean sheets and fell past the windows with soft, heavy sighs. The station seemed to lift slightly under the loss of weight. Toby stood in the front room and listened, one palm resting against the wall near the stove, feeling no drip, no cold thread of meltwater, no steady leak finding its way through ceiling boards. The station had been waiting longer than she had. By January, the chimney began shedding itself in red dust. The first sign appeared on the stove tile one morning after a night of hard wind. A line of powdered mortar lay beneath the interior wall, fine as cinnamon, with 2 small brick flakes beside it. Toby touched the powder and rolled it between finger and thumb. It broke down too easily. Not soot. Not creosote. Mortar that had lost its bond, Outside, the chimney looked worse once she knew where to stand. 3 upper courses had spalling bricks, their faces flaked away by freeze and thaw until the brick core showed pale and soft. Mortar joints on the windward side had recessed nearly 1/2 an inch. The bent cap, which she had meant to straighten later, had allowed water to enter along one edge. Later had arrived, as later often does, carrying a bill. She took the manual, the blueprints, and a paper rubbing of the worst joint to Mr. Barker. He gave the chimney one look through the photograph she had taken with a borrowed disposable camera from the drugstore, then went to the rear shelf without comment. He returned with a torn paper sack labelled hydraulic lime, another smaller bag of fire clay, and a coffee can of clean masonry sand. "Do not patch old soft brick with hard modern cement," he said. "It will break the brick to save the joint." I read that. Good. Read it again. They mixed a trial batch on a scrapboard behind the store while his afternoon customers came and went. 2 parts clean sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, 1/4 part fire clay for heat resistance near the flue, water added in small measures until the mortar held a ridge without slumping. Too wet, and it would shrink; too dry, and it would not bond. He made her smear 1 sample across the board, then cut it with the trowel. "See that? Yes. What? It stands but does not tear. Good enough for a first patch. Not good enough to boast." She carried the materials up in 3 trips over 2 days. The sack of lime rode against her hip like a sleeping child, heavier each time the grade rose. Snow squeaked underfoot in the morning, then softened by afternoon into boot prints that froze again before dark. The temperatures held in the 20s for most of the month, sometimes rising to 28, sometimes dropping low enough that her breath froze on her scarf before she reached the walnut trees. Chimney work had a different patience from roofing. Roofing moved in visible courses, 1 row then another. A roof changed its face as it healed. Chimney repair disappeared into joints and waited to be judged by smoke. She began with cleaning, always cleaning. Mortar that had failed had to be raked out to sound material, not merely skimmed over. She used a narrow cold chisel, a stiff brush, and the small screwdriver where the joint was tight. Each stroke released more powder. Brick dust collected under her nails. At times the chimney seemed less like masonry than memory losing its edges. Harold Pike came once, looked up, and said, "Scaffold. Ladder and planks. Not alone. I can work from the lower roof. You can also fall from it." He stayed 3 hours. Not teaching. Merely standing where he could swear if she did something unwise. By then she had learned that help often came disguised as criticism so the giver would not feel exposed. The work took 3 weeks. Every 15 minutes, sometimes every 10, her bare hands went numb enough that she had to stop and warm them inside her coat. Gloves were too clumsy for proper joint work. Bare fingers could feel the mortar pack around the brick edges, but they paid for the knowledge. She developed a rhythm. Rake, brush, dampen the joint with a small paintbrush so old brick would not steal water too fast from the mortar. Press the mix in from the back. Pack firm, strike the joint, clean the face before it skinned over. Step back, breathe into the hands. Inside she let the stove go cold during exterior repairs because temperature differences could crack new work. On those days she worked without heat, then lit only a modest fire after the mortar had set enough and the evening had drawn down hard. The room suffered with her. Frost returned to the lower window panes, the water bottle iced at the neck. The floorboards tightened and complained. She wore all her clothes to sleep and tucked the blueprints under the bench where damp could not curl their edges. One afternoon, wind came so hard across the shelf that it lifted loose snow from the service road and threw it sideways against the chimney. Toby had packed half a joint and was trying to finish before the mortar stiffened. Her hands had gone from pain to the pale absence beyond pain. She looked at the trowel, then at the joint, then at the sky, and for a moment did nothing at all. No thought arrived shaped like surrender. Only the plain knowledge that fingers which could not feel brick could not repair brick. She covered the mix, climbed down, went inside, and sat with her hands wrapped around the cold stovepipe until feeling returned in burning waves. Then she made a smaller batch and worked only where the wall blocked the wind. That was how January taught her scale. Not the scale of the whole job. The scale of one possible hour. By the last week of the month, the upper spalled bricks had been faced with lime wash where replacement would have required tearing down more than she could safely rebuild. 2 broken units near the cap had been cut out and replaced with salvaged brick Mr. Barker found behind his store, each soaked before laying so it would not rob the mortar. The cap was reset with a slight slope away from the flue. The flashing received careful roofing cement along the upper seam and a metal counterflashing tucked under the siding where wind had been driving meltwater behind it. The test fire came on January 29th. She waited until afternoon, when the new joints had cured enough and the air was still. The fire was small, paper, shavings, 3 sticks of dry walnut deadfall. She opened the draft and watched. Flame leaned upward. Smoke entered the flue and did not hesitate. Outside she walked around the station and looked up at the chimney. The smoke rose clean. No backdraft at the stove door. No black stain curling from cracks. No bitter smell leaking through the wall. Just a thin grey line rising straight into winter air, then breaking apart where sunlight touched it. She stood below with her hands tucked under her arms and watched until the last thread vanished. Inside, the room warmed more quickly than before, as if the chimney had remembered its work and accepted it. She sat on the floor by the stove and ate beans from the enamel mug, plain beans with a pinch of salt Mr. Barker had included in a paper twist. The food was ordinary, the heat was ordinary, the smoke going where it was meant to go was ordinary. Ordinary felt almost holy when it returned after absence. The floor could no longer be avoided once the chimney stopped demanding her whole attention. She had stepped around the pencil crosses for weeks, learning their positions so well that she avoided them even in darkness. But the station was becoming less a temporary shelter and more a place with memory underfoot, and a person could not live indefinitely by dodging weakness. The blueprints gave the framing, heavy beams below, old white pine planks above, patched in places with whatever men had on hand when work mattered more than appearance. The east wall had suffered most from water. The bunk room floor was worn but steady. The front room needed both caution and mercy. She lifted the first damaged plank with a pry bar borrowed from Harold. It came up slowly, held by hand-cut rosehead nails that resisted like teeth. She saved every nail she could, straightening some against the anvil face of the roofing hatchet. The wood beneath the stove tile was dark but not rotten. Near the east wall, 2 planks had softened beyond saving. Their underside flaked under her thumb, and a smell rose from them like damp leaves trapped in a cellar. Mr. Barker had old white pine boards stacked in a shed behind the hardware store, salvaged from a house remodel he disapproved of on principle. They wanted imported tile, he said, as if naming a crime. The boards were not free, but he priced them as if they were nearly firewood. Toby carried them up one at a time over 3 days, wrapped in canvas to protect the edges. Each plank had its own slight twist, its own grain, its own nail wounds from a prior life. She planed one edge by hand where it would not fit, shaving slowly until the board settled into place without force. Never force what asks to be understood. The sentence returned often in floor work. Wood told the truth differently from iron. Iron rang, bound, wore, cracked. Wood cupped, swelled, shrunk. Remembered water, accepted nails in one mood and rejected them in another. She learned to leave a narrow gap where seasonal movement would ask for room. She learned to pre-drill near board ends so the old pine would not split. She learned that a nail driven with anger bent faster. After replacing the worst planks, she rented the random orbit sander from Barker & Son for $14 a day. The machine was heavier than she expected. Mr. Barker set it on the counter and placed one hand flat on top. This is not a cure for bad boards. I replaced the bad boards, mostly. Yes, mostly is a word that bites. I replaced the boards that failed under all pressure. The rest held. He nodded once. 80 grit first. Let the machine work. Do not bear down. 120 after that. 220 only when you're tired enough to be gentle. She bought discs in 3 grits and a paper mask that pinched her nose raw within the first hour. Sanding changed the station by violence disguised as refinement. The machine growled across the boards, throwing dust into the room until sunlight became visible in thick moving shafts. She worked in sections, always with the grain, never staying too long in one hollow. 80 grit opened the wood and took away splinters, grime, old finish, boot-blackened paths, and a century of surface weather. 120 softened the harshness left behind. 220, done near evening with shoulders trembling, brought up the grain in a way her fingers could feel before her eyes fully saw it. She cleaned between passes. Sweep. Vacuum with Mr. Barker's old shop vacuum whose hose was wrapped twice in silver tape. Wipe with a barely damp rag. Wait for dust to settle. Begin again. The first day took the front room. The second took the bunk room and the approach to the machinery bay. She did not sand the machinery bay plates or heavy timbers yet. That space belonged to another order of work, one that involved grease, alignment, and patience of a different depth. When the sanding was done, the floor looked almost raw enough to hurt. The old white pine had emerged uneven, honest, marked by nail shadows, water stains that did not fully lift, patches where the boards changed age, and traffic paths worn by boots long gone. In the stove light it held a dark honey colour. When she wiped the first coat of oil, the honey deepened toward mahogany at the knots and along the grain where years had compressed the wood under human weight. She used a mix Mr. Barker recommended. Tongue oil cut lightly for penetration on the first coat, then a slower linseed blend for the second and third, each wiped thin and given 48 hours to cure. Thin, she had said, not generous. Generous oil stayed sticky and collected dirt. Proper oil entered. Then let the wood breathe. She followed the instruction more carefully than hunger. First coat. Wipe on, wait, wipe off the excess, watch for puddles, hang rags outside flat to dry because oily rags could heat and burn if left wadded. 48 hours. Second coat. Less thirst from the wood now, more glow. Another 48 hours. Third coat, hand rubbed with a cloth until her shoulder ached and the floor took on a low, settled sheen that did not look new, only relieved. There was one bad morning. It came between the second and third coat, after a night of poor sleep and wind that made the new roof flex just enough to remind her that no repair was absolute. She woke before dawn already tired in a way rest did not reach. The stove had gone out, her boots were stiff. Her left wrist ached from sanding, and both knees were bruised from working low. The room held every task she had not yet done. Window cracks, door latch, machinery bay, drainage, ledger, money hidden too poorly, letter too large to carry and too important to leave. She lit the stove badly. Smoke rolled once before the draft caught. She spilled water near the desk. The enamel mug slipped from her hand and struck the floor hard enough to chip the rim. After that, she sat back on her heels and did not move. Work could become another way of running if a person used it to avoid being still. She had begun to understand this and did not like understanding it. By mid-morning she put on her coat and walked down, not into town, but along the drainage below the station where snow had thinned near a marshy bend of the creek. The ground there was half ice, half black water, with cattails broken and laid over by weather. She sat on a flat stone with her hands inside her sleeves. A great blue heron stood at the far edge where the water opened. It should have gone somewhere kinder, she thought, then let the thought pass because the bird had its own account with winter. It stood on one leg, grey and exact, its long neck folded into itself, patient beyond any human schedule. For nearly an hour it did nothing. Then, without warning, its head moved downward and came back with a small silver fish caught crosswise in its bill. Toby watched until it lifted away on slow wings. She did not work that day. No roof failed because of it. No chimney collapsed. The floor waited under its second coat and cured in the cold room without her attention. At dusk she returned to the station, lit the stove properly, ate what remained of the beans, and set the chipped mug on the desk with the damaged side turned toward the wall. The next morning she rubbed the third coat into the pine. February entered through the windows before it entered the calendar. There were 8 of them, if she counted the narrow bunkroom sash and the small square one high in the machinery bay. 3 had no glass at all, only cloudy plastic stapled over the openings from some county attempt to discourage weather. 4 were cracked across 1 pane or more. 1 in the front room facing the canyon still held its original wavy glass, marked in the corner with a tiny date scratched by a glazier's point long before the station had been moved into its present shape. The mark read 1908, not 1788 as the smeared inspection sheet had suggested, but the error made the pane no less precious. It would not be replaced. The intact pane bent the mountains when she looked through it. That was how old glass told time. Mr. Barker sold her 2 salvage sashes that could be cut down for parts, 4 panes of single-strength glass, DAP 33 glazing putty, glazing points, a small push tool, a roll of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, and a paper packet of brass screws. He gave her a lesson at the counter, using a broken frame from his back room. Dig out old putty without gouging the rabbit. Prime bare wood first, or the putty dries wrong. Bed the glass in a thin putty line, points every 8 inches. Tool the face bevel clean. Not pretty. Clean? He made the bevel with his putty knife in 1 slow motion. She tried. The putty wrinkled. He scraped it off. Again. The 2nd attempt sagged. Again. The 3rd held a line. Acceptable. From him. Like Harold. The word carried weight. Back at the station, window work began with removal. Each sash had to be freed from paint, swelling, rusted screws, or simple neglect. She labelled them with pencil on the upper rail. Front left, front right, bunk south, bunk west, bay high, porch side, east wall, door light. Labels prevented future arguments. The original glass sash stayed in place, protected with cardboard and tape, while she worked around it. The first empty frame took half a day. Old putty came out in chips, then crumbs, then stubborn smears that clung to the wood as if it had grown there. She used the glazing knife, then a dull chisel, then sandpaper wrapped around a scrap. Beneath the rot-grey surface, the wood remained sound enough. She brushed on primer and waited because the instructions said wait, and waiting had become one of the station's trades. The DAP 33 was stiff in the cold. She warmed the can near, not on the stove, until the putty yielded under thumb pressure. Too warm and it would smear. Too cold and it would tear. She rolled it into ropes between her palms, pressed a thin bed into the rabbet, set the glass gently, and pushed glazing points into the wood every 8 inches, closer where the frame had warped. Then came the face putty. The bevel Mr. Barker had made look simple. Hers was not simple. The knife caught, skipped, dragged, lifted. She scraped and reset more than once. By evening, the first pane held. It did not look professional if examined closely. It looked weather-ready. The 2nd and 3rd windows went better. The 4th cracked during setting because she pressed too hard near one corner and had forgotten to support the glass from beneath. The sound was small, a clean bright tick. She froze with both hands on the sash, looking at the line that spread from the edge like a mistake made in ink. For a full minute she did not breathe correctly. Then she removed the broken pane, wrapped the shards in newspaper, and wrote 1 word on the back of the sash in pencil. Gentler. She did not scrape the word away. Sash cords were a separate lesson. The front room windows had old counterweights hidden in side pockets, their original cords broken to brown fuzz. She removed the access panel, and a cast-iron weight thudded softly inside the wall when she touched it. The new cord was 1/4-inch cotton, not synthetic, because Mr. Barker said old pulleys preferred natural fibre, and because he disliked nylon in historic windows with a moral force that had almost made her smile. She fed the cord over the pulley with a length of wire, tied it to the counterweight with a figure-8 knot, then tested the knot 3 times before replacing the pocket panel. The first attempt left the sash too low. She untied, shortened, retied. The 2nd sat high. The 3rd balanced properly, rising and lowering without slam or complaint. A working window changed the room more than she expected. It allowed control, air when needed. Closure when needed. Not merely a hole covered against harm, but an agreement between inside and outside. By the time 6 windows had glass, the station no longer felt as if weather had the right to enter anywhere it pleased. The original front pane received no replacement, only cleaning. She used warm water, vinegar, and a rag soft enough not to scratch. Dirt came away in brown streaks. Paint flecks lifted from the corners. The wavy glass remained imperfect, thickened slightly near the lower edge with tiny bubbles caught inside like seeds. Through it, the canyon bent at the margins. Lights below shifted when she moved her head. The mountains seemed to breathe. "Stay," she said to the pane, barely aloud. It did. The last window was the bunkroom west sash. By then her hands knew the putty better. The frame had no square corner left, so she measured the opening 3 ways and cut the salvaged glass to the smallest truth. She bedded it, set points, trimmed the bevel, and cleaned the edge with a putty knife dipped in mineral spirits. Outside, late February light held the walnut branches in a pale wash. A chickadee landed on the nearest branch while she was tooling the final line. The bird was round against the cold, black cap bright, feet thin as wire on the bark. It tipped its head once and looked through the newly set glass into the little room. Toby kept the knife still until it flew. Only after the branch lifted back into place did she finish the bevel, wipe the tool, and set the sash upright to cure beside the stove. She had not fixed everything. The road still cut away at the washout. The machinery bay still held more questions than answers. The pump had not been rebuilt. The outhouse leaned, and the hidden money remained a responsibility rather than a rescue. But that night, when wind came down the slope, it no longer moved through the station as owner. It pressed against roof, chimney, floor, and windows, testing each in turn. Inside, the flame in the stove held steady. The plaster failed after the windows began holding. It seemed almost impolite of it, as if one repaired portion of the station had given another permission to confess. The first patch opened near the chimney, where heat had dried old material too quickly for too many winters. A crescent of wall loosened behind the stove and fell during the night, landing in pale pieces on the tile. The second appeared above the bunkroom door, a soft bulge that sounded detached when tapped. The third, along the east wall, had already failed years before and been hidden behind a sheet of cardboard nailed over it by someone who valued concealment more than repair. Behind the breaks was the original work. Horsehair plaster on hand-split oak lath, each strip nailed unevenly because the person who split it had followed grain rather than factory measurement. The lath had darkened with age but remained strong in most places. The plaster keys had failed only where water or heat had broken them. Toby stood with a candle held near the wall and looked into the little ravines left by time. She could see hair in the plaster, fine and brown, caught in the lime like threads in old bread. Mr. Barker had a bag of horsehair in the back room. Of course he did. It came from the 1950s, he said, left by a plasterer who had paid part of a bill with materials and never returned for the balance. The paper sack was folded 3 times and tied with twine. When he opened it, the hair inside still smelled faintly of barn dust and decades. He sold her only what she needed and refused to weigh it too precisely. "You are patching a wall," he said, "not feeding a scale." The mix was slower than mortar, lime putty, clean sand, a small amount of gauging plaster where speed was needed, though he warned her not to trust speed. Horsehair teased apart by hand so it would not clump. Water added with restraint. She mixed the first batch too wet, and it slid down the hawk in a tired fold. Mr. Barker looked at it. "Soup," she added sand and lime. He looked again. Better soup. By the third try the plaster held on the trowel with a soft weight that did not run. At the station she cut back the failed edges to sound material, not square, because old walls did not fail in squares, and forcing them into neat geometry would have wasted good plaster. She brushed dust from the lath, misted it lightly, and pressed the scratch coat into the gaps until it pushed between the lath strips and mushroomed behind them. That was the key. The wall held not because the surface looked smooth, but because the plaster gripped from the hidden side. Before it set, she scored the scratch coat with a homemade comb of nails driven through a scrap of wood. Lines. Cross lines. Tooth for the next coat. The brown coat came after the first had stiffened, 3/8 of an inch, as close as her eye and a marked stick could judge. She built it proud enough for levelling, then scraped back until the plane of the old wall and new patch nearly agreed. 72 hours of curing followed, not because she wanted to wait, but because Lime asked time in exchange for strength. She kept the room gently warm, not hot. She misted the patches when they seemed too dry. The house smelled of wet stone, horsehair, stove smoke, and patience. The finish coat was only 1/8 of an inch. That thinness made it harder, not easier. The trowel had to float rather than dig. Too much pressure pulled sand through the surface. Too little left ridges that would catch light forever. She worked at the chimney patch first, ruined one corner, scraped it back, and began again. By the east wall her hand had learned the motion: lift, press, draw, feather, clean the blade, draw again. When the last patch had set enough to hold its face, she stood in the middle of the room and looked at the 3 pale places drying against the older plaster. They did not match. They should not have. The wall now showed its repairs honestly, like a coat mended by someone who respected the cloth. "These patches will hold another 100 years, she said it quietly, not as a prediction, but as a promise offered to Lime, Lath, and the unknown hands that had made the first wall. Doris came by way of paper bags. The first one appeared on the porch step on a Tuesday morning when Toby was working putty from under her nails with the tip of a matchstick. It was a brown cafe bag, folded twice at the top, weighted against wind with a stone. Inside were 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a jar of chicken soup, an apple, and a note written on order pad paper. "Cold hands need broth." No name, but the bag smelled faintly of coffee and pie crust, and that told her enough. She carried the empty jar back to the diner 2 days later, washed and wrapped in newspaper so it would not break in her coat pocket. The diner was narrow and bright, with red stools along the counter and a row of pie plates under glass. The woman in the red apron looked up from filling a salt shaker. "You lost?" "No, ma'am." "Then sit or hand me that jar." Toby placed it on the counter. "I need to pay." "For what?" "The soup." Doris gave the jar a glance, then looked over the top of her glasses. "That was not on the menu. I can work dishes. My dishwasher is my nephew, and he already thinks I'm trying to replace him with anyone who can stand upright. I have money coming. Everyone has money coming." Toby stood still, one hand on the counter edge. "I do not want to take what I cannot return." Doris set the salt shaker down. "In candles when the shop reopens. The station is not a shop." "Not yet." The words were plain, without encouragement painted on them. Doris turned away to lift a coffee pot from its warmer, ending the discussion in the manner of women who had fed too many people to argue over whether hunger was deserving. After that, a bag came once a week, sometimes twice if weather had been hard. Soup, cornbread, a heel of ham, potatoes already baked and wrapped in foil, a piece of pie with the filling slightly collapsed, which meant it could not be sold at the counter but could still restore a body. Toby returned every jar, every tin, every cloth washed and folded. She never found Doris placing the bags. Doris never mentioned them unless Toby forgot to bring back a container, in which case the next note said only. Jar. Caleb arrived with a splitting maul and a Schwinn bicycle. The bicycle was blue beneath scratches, with a milk crate wired to the back and a front fender that rattled over every stone. The boy was perhaps 16, narrow as a fence rail, with hair falling into his eyes and ears reddened by cold. He leaned the bike against a walnut tree one Saturday in late February and stood with the maul over one shoulder, looking at the pile of deadfall Toby had dragged near the woodshed. "My mother said you split wrong." Toby lowered the hand saw. "Did she?" "Yes." "Who is your mother?" "She works at the pharmacy." "That explains the medical confidence." He looked at her without smiling, then set his feet and split one of the rounds cleanly. The maul struck with a note that made the yellow dog downhill begin barking. Caleb worked for 2 hours without explaining himself further. He did not talk unless a log rolled or she set a piece too close to her boot. Then he said, "Move that or watch left," in a voice still negotiating with adulthood. He split the larger rounds she had been avoiding, stacked them under the lean-to by size, and showed her how to turn knotty pieces, so the blade followed the crack rather than fought the knot. When she offered money, he shook his head. "I pay for work." My mother said, "About splitting, about your grandfather?" The word struck more strongly than the maul had. Toby did not correct him. The exact branch of the family tree mattered less to the boy than the memory his mother had handed him. "What did she say?" "That he fixed our furnace in a storm and would not take money because I had pneumonia." Caleb lifted another round, set it upright, and split it with one clean swing. She said I could do 2 Saturdays. He came for 5. On the 5th, Toby set a small packet on his bicycle seat before he left. Inside were 3 old cotter pins from the station, cleaned and polished, and 1 brass washer from the coffee can in the machinery bay. Not payment, not exactly. A boy who noticed mechanisms might keep such things in a drawer and understand later that usefulness could be beautiful. He opened the packet, looked at it, then tucked it into his coat pocket without comment. Reverend Boyd did not enter the station. He walked past every morning at nearly the same hour, though past was not quite accurate because the service road did not lead to any place one would choose for a simple walk in winter. He was a tall, spare man with a black coat gone shiny at the elbows and a felt hat brushed so often the nap had thinned. His church stood below the cemetery, but each morning he climbed above town, followed the road as far as the walnut trees, tipped his hat toward the station, and turned back. The first week, Toby assumed he wanted to see whether she would fail. The second week, she understood he was counting smoke. If the chimney drew, she was alive. If no smoke rose, perhaps he would come closer. But smoke rose most mornings, and so he stayed on the road, a respectful distance from a woman building privacy out of salvaged boards and labour. On the first Sunday in March, she was outside clearing snow from the drainage channel when he paused below the station. Morning. He looked at the channel, then at the roof, then at the chimney. Work is prayer too. 4 words. He tipped his hat and went on. After that, when he passed, Toby sometimes lifted one hand. Sometimes she did not see him until he was already heading downhill, his figure narrow against the snow. Once he left a bundle of kindling tied with twine under the porch cover. Once, after a storm, she found that someone had cleared the first 30 feet of road below the washout with a shovel whose blade made a different pattern from hers. No note. No sermon, only the marks of passage, repeated until they became part of the station's morning. She postponed the cellar until February 11th. There were reasons, and some were good. Roof before cellar, chimney before cellar, floor before cellar, windows before cellar. A person did not go underground in a building whose upper parts had not yet proven they wished to remain above her. Other reasons had less structure around them. The cellar door was in the machinery bay, half hidden beneath a steel plate and a collapsed shelf. The blueprints marked it clearly, but the station itself seemed to keep that portion of its silence more deeply than the rest. On the morning she finally opened it, the air had gone still. She cleared the shelf piece by piece, a warped board, a rusted pulley frame, 2 bottles, a box of mouse-chewed rags, then the steel plate which took all her weight on a pry bar before it lifted with a scrape that echoed under the floor. Beneath it was a wooden hatch with an iron ring recessed into the planks. The ring moved only after oil and tapping. When she lifted, cold cellar air rose into the machinery bay, carrying the smell of stone, earth, and long darkness. The stairs were granite, 7 steps down, each worn in the centre by feet that had gone up and down carrying cans, parts, perhaps food during storms. She held a lantern in one hand and kept the other on the wall. The fieldstone floor below measured roughly 12 by 15 feet, larger than she expected, with walls built into the slope and mortar still holding in most joints. Moisture shone between some stones, but there was no standing water. A shelf ran along the north wall, empty except for 2 jars filled with rusted nails and 1 broken insulator. In the center of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not belong to the rougher field stone around it. It was rectangular, smooth-edged, and set with intention. Carved near one corner was a small craft mark, a wheel with 6 spokes crossed by a plumb line. The same mark appeared in miniature on the bow of the brass key she would soon find. Though she did not yet know it, she knelt and brushed dust from the carving with her sleeve. The slab had an iron lifting ring. She did not touch it. Not because curiosity failed, but because the seller had already told her enough for one morning. A central slab with a mark, set into the earth beneath a station where a hidden compartment had held money and drawings, was not a thing to lift because the hand itched. It belonged to a later day, a stronger floor, a clearer mind, perhaps another witness. She set the lantern on the shelf and stood. "Not today," she said. The words went into the stone and stayed there. On the way back up, she saw the oak box. It was wedged beneath the 3rd step from the bottom, so tight against the underside that it looked at first like part of the stair support. Only the difference in grain gave it away. Granite stair, fieldstone wall, then oak dark and dry, shaped into a compact rectangle no longer than her hand. She worked it loose with the pocket knife and the smallest screwdriver from the blue box, careful not to scar the stair more than time already had. The box had no lock. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype photograph. The key was small, heavy for its size, with a bow shaped like the craft mark on the granite slab. A 6-spoked wheel crossed by a plumb line. Its bit was narrow and complicated, made for a lock finer than any door latch in the station. She held it in her palm and felt its cold give way slowly to skin. The photograph had been wrapped in a piece of black cloth. A young woman stood before the station in summer. The siding behind her looked newer, the sign sharper, the roof unscarred by decades. She wore a long skirt, a white blouse with sleeves rolled at the forearms, and boots muddy at the hem. In one hand she held a hand scraper. Her face was not Toby's face exactly, but it was close enough in the set of the mouth, the directness of the gaze, and the way she stood with one shoulder slightly forward, as if ready to return to work after the photographer finished. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "Ruth Ann Rook, daughter of Abel, age 25, summer of 1903. The date made Toby frown because the station in its present form had not yet been completed, according to the drawings. Then she looked again at the background, at the timber platform, at the early winch frame visible through the open bay door, not the final station perhaps. The first version, the beginning of the work before maps settled it into official lines. She carried the key and photograph upstairs. The cellar hatch closed with a sound that did not feel final, only deferred. She set the tintype on the desk beside the letter and stood looking at the young woman until the stove needed tending. The resemblance did not comfort her in the way a person might expect. It placed a weight in her hands. Not blood alone, not destiny, nothing so loud, more like being handed a tool still warm from another worker and understanding that the task was not finished. The key went on the mantel. If the narrow shelf above the stove could be called a mantel, it sat beside the candle, the brass plumb bob, and a piece of walnut shell she had picked up near the spring. Each morning while adding kindling, Toby saw it there. Some days she wondered what it opened. Other days she was glad not to know. A mystery could be kept without being consumed. The station had already waited through many impatient people. She would not become another. In March, the snow retreated uphill and left the world looking bruised. The service road emerged in broken pieces, mud showing through tyre ruts that had not carried tyres in months. The washout ran loud with meltwater brown at first, then clearing where stones took over from soil. Around the walnut trees the snow collapsed inward and revealed shells, old leaves, and the dark mouths of squirrel tunnels. The spring seep grew stronger by degrees until water crossed the shallow channel she had cleared and ran under a skim of ice in the mornings. The creek below the station became loud with snow melt. Not picturesque loud, working loud, it struck stone, undercut banks, dragged small branches, filled hollows, and spoke all night through the floor when the wind was still. The station listened with its new roof, patched chimney, sealed windows, oiled floor, and pale plaster scars. None of the repairs made it young. They made it able. Walnut catkins appeared in April, green-brown and modest, hanging from the branches like small tassels. The chickadee returned with another bird, and both took possession of the tree nearest the bunkroom window. Hank, the yellow dog, followed Toby up the road one morning and lay in a patch of sun near the porch while she cleared winter debris from the drainage channel. His owner did not call him back until noon. By then, Toby had opened the blueprints fully and begun copying the mountain drawings on cheaper paper for daily use. She traced drainage lines, anchor foundations, timber cribbing, and the old cable path. The main winch remained untouched beyond cleaning the gearbox exterior and replacing the hidden steel plug after wrapping the waterproof case in oilcloth and moving it to a dry compartment under the desk. She had not drained the old oil. She had not turned the drum. She had not pretended that discovery qualified her for resurrection. The craft could wait. The letter's instructions sat beside the drawings, read often, obeyed more by restraint than action. She decided in the first week of April that she would not begin full mechanical restoration that spring, not because she was afraid of the work, because fear and respect can feel similar from a distance, and she had learned to tell them apart by whether the hand hurried. She would order materials with 1 coin. Not a large bill. Not a band of money. 1 coin from the loose purse, exchanged carefully, and recorded in the ledger she had begun on clean pages from Mr. Barker. With it she would buy small stock, gasket paper, proper scraper blades, layout die, and sample pieces of bronze and steel. She would practice on damaged parts first. She would make mistakes where mistakes did not endanger anyone. She would learn to scrape bearing surfaces on scrap before touching the winch. She would study brake lining. She would clean anchor bolts. She would ask questions when pride preferred silence. The waterproof case had given her means. The station had given her sequence. On a warm afternoon in late April, she opened both front windows for the first time and let air pass through from the canyon to the walnut trees. Dust lifted from places she had not reached. The candle flame on the mantel trembled, though it was unlit, as if remembering weather. She sat at the desk and wrote the first proper entry in the ledger. April 23rd. Roof holding. Chimney drawing clean. Floor cured. Windows set. Water channel open. Do not rush the winch. She read the line twice, then closed the book. Outside, meltwater ran bright under the walnut roots. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, on December 14th, 2024, the first finished piece lay on the workbench before sunrise. It was not large, a hand-scraped bronze-bearing shell fitted to a restored auxiliary guide pulley, polished only where contact required it, and left matte everywhere else. No one passing the station from the road would have known what it meant. It did not glitter. It did not announce itself. Its beauty lived in tolerances measured by feeler gauge and bluing compound. In the even contact pattern Toby had worked toward through weeks of filing, scraping, checking, cleaning, and beginning again. Snow stood 4 inches deep outside the machinery bay. The stove had been lit since 5. The windows held their faint winter frost along the lower edges, and the patched plaster near the chimney had cured to a colour only slightly lighter than the original wall. On the bench lay the tools that had come from the hidden case: machinist's level, micrometer, plumb bob, scraper. Beside them lay newer tools bought slowly, one at a time, each entered into the ledger with date, cost, and purpose. Toby turned the pulley by hand. It moved without chatter. Not perfectly. Perfection was often a word used by people who did not have to maintain anything after the applause ended. It moved honestly. The bearing carried the shaft with an even feel. The repaired bracket sat square. The grease channel had been cleared with wire and solvent until fresh lubricant reached where it was supposed to go. She turned it again, slower, then stopped and placed one hand flat on the bench. The first complete repair was a modest one. That made it fit. The station by then had become a roomed and working life rather than a rescue scene. The front room held a narrow iron bed built from a salvaged frame, a mattress bought new after the second winter's first storm, a pine table under the canyon window, and the desk that had once blocked the door each night. The stove stood blacked and sound on repaired tile. Above it, on the mantel shelf, were the candle, the brass key, the plumb bob when it was not in use, and the tintype of Ruth Ann in front of the earlier station. The floor had darkened further under oil and boot traffic, honey in morning light, mahogany near the stove by evening. The bunk room had shelves now, not many, one for folded clothes, one for manuals, one for ledgers, one for letters she had not yet answered, because some words deserved more than a tired hand at midnight. The closet held jars of nails sorted by type, hinge screws, glazing points, sash cord, stove rope, and 3 paper bags from Doris folded flat for reuse. In the machinery bay the main winch stood cleaned but not polished, its gearbox drained, flushed, inspected, and refilled with proper oil. It had not been powered, it had been understood in stages. Outside the drainage channel was lined with stone where spring water once wandered. The outhouse stood upright after Caleb helped brace its back wall. The pump had been rebuilt with a new leather cup, and now brought up cold water after 6 strokes if primed. The porch had a railing made from salvaged pipe, not pretty, but secure enough that Harold Pike had leaned against it and said nothing, which was as close as he came to praise. The brass key stayed unknown until the second winter. It happened after a storm dropped wet snow, then froze hard overnight. Toby went out with a broom to clear weight from the lower walnut branches before ice could tear them. Near the largest tree, the one holding the swallowed horseshoe, a limb had cracked and fallen cleanly away from the trunk. Not a large limb, but old enough that its loss revealed a hollow seam behind the place where the bark had grown around iron. She saw brass inside the tree. Not bright, dark with age, green at the edges, nearly hidden under folded bark. She brushed snow away with her glove, then fetched a wooden wedge, a chisel, and the lantern. She did not cut living wood. She cleared only dead fibres around the seam until a small plate appeared, set into the hollow trunk behind the curve of the horseshoe. The plate carried the same 6-spoked wheel and plumb-line mark as the key bow and the granite slab in the cellar. The key fit after 2 drops of oil and a long wait. The lock turned with less resistance than she expected, as if the tree had been keeping the mechanism dry in its own way. A narrow brass door opened inward, no wider than her hand, revealing a cavity lined with tin. Inside lay a folded flag, a note wrapped in waxed paper, and a small packet of dried lavender that had given up most of its scent, but not all. The flag had 48 stars. She unfolded it only as far as the table would allow and stopped when she understood that it had been folded by someone who knew the work. Not ceremonial triangle, but careful storage fold, cotton protected from damp by oilcloth and the living wall of the tree. The note was dated June 6th, 1944. The hand was older than Clara Mae's, broader, more slanted. To the one who finds this after the guns have had their say. My name is Ruth Ann Rook. My son Andrew is across the ocean with other mothers' sons, and today the radio says men have gone ashore in France under a sky full of iron. I'm placing this flag here because the house has always needed one place to hold what cannot be said aloud. If Andrew comes home, we will laugh at my superstition and take it out together. If he does not, then let the tree keep what the house cannot bear on its walls. We are people who mend machinery, but there are breaks no file can square and no flame can soften. Still, mark this. A nation is not kept by speeches alone. It is kept by those who repair the road after flood, who brace the roof before snow, who feed the cold hand, who save the drawings, who teach a child the right way to listen before turning a bolt. If you're reading this, keep something, not everything, no one can, but keep something well. Ruth Ann Rook, Telluride Station, June 6, 1944. Toby read the note at the table while snow slid from the roof in soft thuds. The date had weight beyond the room. She had learned enough from the documents to know that Andrew had not returned from Europe, that the medal in the velvet pouch belonged to a man whose mother had placed a flag inside a tree on the day armies crossed water under fire. The station did not make history grander. It made it closer. A mother's hand, a folded flag, a tree growing around a secret until the person meant to find it had learned not to pry too soon. She refolded the flag along the old lines and placed it in an acid-free box Mr. Barker ordered from a preservation supplier after pretending not to be moved by the story. The note went beside Clara Mae's letter in a flat archival sleeve. The brass key returned to the mantel, no longer unanswered, though she kept the tree door oiled and closed. On December 16th, 2024, she took the medal to Lone Tree Cemetery above town. It was the anniversary of a bitter winter engagement recorded in Andrew's service papers, not a public ceremony, not a day anyone else had marked on the town calendar. Snow lay shallow between the stones. Reverend Boyd walked with her as far as the gate and then stayed back because he understood without being told that some honours required fewer witnesses. Toby found the grave where the family name had been added later. Though Andrew's body had remained overseas, she brushed snow from the stone, set the medal in its velvet pouch on the top for 1 minute, and stood with her hands folded. No speech came. The wind moved through dry grass at the fence. After the minute passed, she wrapped the medal again and carried it home. It did not belong to the cemetery any more than it belonged hidden in a gearbox. It belonged to the kept record, to the house, to the next hand that would need to understand the cost beneath ordinary things. The money had lasted because she treated it like a beam, not a purse. Only 3 coins were spent in the first spring, then 1 more in the following fall, then a 5th when the pump repair required a part she could not salvage. Each coin was listed in the ledger before it left her hand. The larger bills remained sealed in the waterproof case, moved at last into a hidden but dry compartment she built beneath the desk with a proper lock and a false bottom that would not impress a thief with time, but would defeat carelessness. She used wages from repair work, credit earned and repaid, small sales and slow barter for most of the rebuilding. Mr. Barker objected to her paying down the hardware account too regularly. "You trying to put me out of the charity business? You said it was credit. I say many things. I wrote it as credit." He accepted the folded bills, entered them in his ledger, and made a mark beside her name. What mark is that? Means stubborn. That is not bookkeeping. It is in this store. The hidden cash stayed mostly whole. For the next one. That phrase entered the station's ledger without ceremony on a wet evening, when Toby had been tempted, briefly and practically, to use more of it. A better truck would save trips. Newer equipment would speed work. A contractor could finish in weeks what took her months. Each thought was not wrong by itself. Each became wrong when it began speaking in the voice of haste, so she wrote the phrase and closed the ledger. The shop reopened so quietly that no one could later agree on the first day. There was no sign at first, only an index card on the corkboard inside Doris's cafe, tucked between a notice for piano lessons and a lost orange cat. Mechanical repair, small winches, pulleys, stove parts, hand tools, alignment work. Slow work done carefully. Leave name with Doris. Doris pinned it there without asking whether the wording was too plain. People who need careful can read, she said. The first job was a sticky block and tackle from a ranch outside Norwood, then a cracked stove grate, then a hand-cranked cider press, whose gears had skipped for years, then a barn door roller, a pump handle, a rusted vise, a broken shear, a snowblower chute she disliked but repaired because the owner was old and the storm was coming. Payment came in checks, cash, potatoes, eggs, a wool blanket, 2 jars of peaches, and once a box of machine screws sorted perfectly by a retired machinist who said he had no use for them and then stayed 3 hours discussing thread pitch. By the end of that winter, Doris kept a mailing list in a school notebook under the cafe counter. 43 names. Not customers, Doris insisted. Names? Some wanted notice when Toby began offering restored pulleys. Some wanted to know when she would teach basic maintenance. Some had old tools they wanted identified. Some only liked the idea that the upper station had smoke in its chimney again and a careful person inside. Toby did not become famous. She became reachable. There is a difference, and it preserved her. Caleb returned the next March with a wooden sign wrapped in a bedsheet. He was taller by then, shoulders broader, hair cut shorter because he had started part-time work with a carpenter. The Schwinn had been replaced by a battered pickup borrowed from his uncle, though the blue bicycle bell hung from the rear-view mirror on a wire. He carried the sign alone until Toby came out and took one end despite his protest. "You will drop it trying not to need help," she said. He looked wounded by the accuracy but did not argue. They unwrapped it on the porch. The wood was walnut. Not from the living trees by the spring, but from a fallen limb Harold had helped mill into boards the year before. The letters had been carved by hand, uneven if measured with a ruler, exact if measured by care. Rook and daughters. Mechanical repair and mountain works. The plural stopped her. She read it once. Then again. Caleb shifted his weight. "I can plane it down if you hate it. I do not hate it. My mother said the old trade had women in it. It did. Doris said daughters should be plural, even if there is one, because it leaves room." Toby touched the carved ampersand. It curved like a cable under load. "There are no daughters here." Caleb shrugged in the guarded way of boys offering something delicate. "Not yet. Or maybe not like that." Harold Pike, who had arrived unnoticed and was leaning on the pipe railing, looked at the sign. "Letters are shallow." Caleb reddened. "I can cut deeper." Did not say bad. Said shallow. Toby ran her hand along the lower edge where Caleb had sanded with care, then looked toward the machinery bay, the walnut trees, the spring, the road down to town, the long path of kindnesses that had not asked for permission to continue. "We can hang it under the old sign," she said. Caleb looked up quickly. "Not replace it." "No, because the old sign still mattered. Telluride service, incline, upper operating station. Its letters had been cut by someone whose hands deserved to remain. The new sign did not erase the first. It hung below it from two black iron brackets Mr. Barker found in his storeroom and claimed had been waiting for a job less foolish than decorating a hardware shelf. They hung it in late afternoon. Harold said the left side was low. Caleb adjusted it. Reverend Boyd, passing at the road, tipped his hat. Doris came up with a bag of biscuits she pretended were for everyone, and then told Caleb he had spelled mechanical correctly, which he received with more relief than any other praise. The sign moved slightly in the wind, then settled. That night, after the others had gone and the road had returned to quiet, Toby stood outside until the cold reached her sleeves. The two signs made a vertical history on the weathered wall, the old one above carved and faded, the new one below hand-cut and uncertain, leaving room in its plural for someone not yet known. Inside, she opened Clara Mae's letter again. The paper had been protected well, but age still asked gentleness. She read the first line, then stopped because she no longer needed the rest in that moment. The opening had begun to work in her for 2 years, gathering its own answer. "My dear one, whoever you are." She took out a clean sheet of paper from the desk drawer, the best paper she owned, and dated it. Then she sat for a long while with the pen uncapped, listening to the stove, the roof, the road, the little sounds of a station no longer empty, but still careful with its speech. At last she wrote the same first words, "My dear one, whoever you are." She did not know who would read it, a girl with cold hands, a boy who had learned to split wood because his mother remembered a debt, an old woman who thought every useful thing had arrived too late, a mechanic not yet born, someone with no blood claim and every right given by attention. She did not write to explain herself. She wrote to keep the chain unbroken where silence might otherwise rust through. She wrote about the roof first, because roofs teach humility. She wrote Harold's name and his 3-stroke nail. She wrote the chimney mix in exact proportions and underlined the warning against hard cement. She wrote the floor grit sequence, the cure times, the sash cord size, the figure-8 knot at the counterweight, the drainage channel below the walnut trees, the cellar slab not yet lifted, the brass door in the largest trunk, the mailing list in Doris's notebook, the way Caleb's sign left room for a future no one had to force. She wrote about money as brace. She wrote about tools as memory. She wrote one sentence about being sent out of a house with a grocery sack and did not write the names of those who had done it. The omission was not mercy for them. It was freedom for the letter. Some stories did not deserve space in a document meant to shelter the next person. Near midnight, she set down the pen and flexed her hand. The station held itself around her, not perfectly, never perfectly. The wind would find new seams. Spring water would need clearing, metal would rust if neglected, mortar would crack if ignored, letters would fade if left in damp. The work would remain because remaining was one of the truest things work could do. She folded the unfinished letter once and placed it under the brass plumb bob so it would lie flat by morning. Outside, the old incline path climbed into dark timber and vanished under snow. The town below kept its lamps. The walnut trees stood with the horseshoe grown into one trunk and the small brass door hidden once more behind bark. The roof shed its snow. The chimney drew. The repaired windows held. The station waits. It has always waited. And in the county clerk's office, in the back of a drawer where Mrs. Morrow kept odd remnants of public business no statute quite explained, 1 $5 bill and 4 $1 bills still lay clipped to a copy of the deed, flattened smooth, marked in pencil with a date and a note only the clerk understood, paid in full.